before joining Cato, he specialized in environmental policy at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. This is interesting. From 2004 to 2006, he served as a Peace Corps volunteer at a place that I'm not going to try to pronounce. Mr. Yeatman holds a BA in Environmental Sciences from the University of Virginia and an MA in International Studies from Denver University Graduate School of International Studies and a JD from Georgetown University Law Center. Mr. Yeatman, I'm going to pass it over to you. If you have till 2:35 and then switch to questions. If you're not switching to questions, then I'll probably hop back on and remind you. If you have switched to Q&A, then I will stay off until it's time to introduce the next speaker. So,
perfect.
Yeah, Mr. Yeatman.
Thank you so much, Thomas, for that welcome intro. I'll note this. Trust me, your hair is perfect. You don't have to worry about that at all. I'm sorry we couldn't all be together in Pittsburgh. This is a bit weird. I'm doing this from my living room. I also feel a bit weird in this thing. I feel like I'm in a boy band or something. But, and also bear with me if there's any technological complications. I'm a bit old and not terribly adept in those spheres. But without further ado, let's get on with the show. So what am I talking about today? I'm going to talk about how our constitutional separation of powers are out of whack. When it comes to domestic policymaking, the president is dominating Congress, and it's constitutionally unhealthy. It's bad news. Now I'm going to explain how this happened, but first, let's start with first principles. The first three articles of the Constitution sets forth our government. Article 1 creates Congress. Article 2 creates the president. And Article 3, of course, creates the Supreme Court. Now, did you notice that Congress came first? That it was the first of the three. That's not an accident. The Founding Fathers took it for granted that Congress was first among equals in our tripartite system of government. Oh my, wait, can I get to the, I'm going to try to get to my slides here. I'm sorry. Oh no, wait 1 second. Open. Bear with me. Oh, I'm sorry. That's the wrong slide, so apologize. Okay, so this will make sense. This is where I'm going with this. I mean, the first slide is the administrative stage, and we've got the seal of the presidency up there in the face. Okay, so the Founding Fathers took it for granted that Congress was first among equals in our tripartite system of government. I'm sorry. Ugh. Pardon me. Again, these technological difficulties. Okay. Indeed, the Founding Fathers, they feared the legislature's power. So it wasn't just that they were first among equals. They designed a government to contain the legislature's power. And that's what I'm getting at with this slide right here. In Federalist 47, James Madison fretted that Congress would be an impetuous vortex, and that's what this slide is, that gobbled up power and wielded it arbitrarily. Basically, the Founding Fathers feared mob rule. They didn't want a majority to be able to run roughshod over individual liberty. If I might explain my slide here, that's Alfred E. Newman. So that's the spokesperson for Mad Magazine. I figured that is the manifestation of impetuous, and there he is. He's in the middle of a vortex. My wife made that for me. I was pretty impressed by it. Okay, so to prevent this possibility, so to prevent the legislature from gobbling up all this power, the Founding Fathers established several constitutional checks, and I'm sure you guys have learned about them. I mean, this is textbook stuff when it comes to the Constitution, Constitution 101. So here I'm talking about indirect democracy through representation. I'm talking about a bicameral legislature, a House and a Senate. I'm talking about the separation of powers into three branches of government, and the checks and balances, like the extent to which the separated powers are endowed with the ability to check one another. So the idea behind all of this was to prevent the concentration of power. And Madison, again, continuing in Federalist 47, called the concentration of power the very definition of tyranny. Okay, so that's how the system was supposed to work. That's how the framers envisioned it. Well, how do things work today? It's a lot different than what the Founding Fathers had in mind, alas. To demonstrate my point of sort of how far we've come from the Founding Fathers' vision of this country and how power worked, consider two recent examples. So one from the Obama era and one from the Trump era. And we'll start with the age of Obama and climate policy in particular. So during Obama's first two terms, Democrats controlled both chambers of Congress. In the 111th Congress, that's the one from 2009 to 2010, the House of Representatives, again under Democratic control, passed a cap and trade scheme to fight climate change, to reduce national greenhouse gas emissions. Ultimately, the measure died in the Democratic-controlled Senate. So even though it was controlled by Democrats, 20% of the Senate Democrat caucus, they actually wrote a letter and they said, we can't support this bill. It's going to cause too much economic harm in these current times. I mean, I don't know if you recall, that was a decade ago in the midst of the last financial crisis, alas. But long story short, Obama's first term, Congress considers a cap and trade to fight climate change. Ultimately, Congress demurs. The Obama administration puts climate change on the back burner. And indeed, during his 2000 election, here, let me get to this, the next slide. During the 2012 election, President Obama, he barely mentioned climate change. Okay, so and this a picture right here. This is the debate from 2012 in Denver. This was amazing. President Obama on that stage tried to outflank Romney's right on energy policy. I mean, that Obama, the one on the debate stage trying to win over a national audience of votes, he was all about oil and gas and even coal. I mean, he was a friend of the fossil fuel industry. That was I note that because of what comes next. So, of course, Obama won in 2012. So that means he no longer faces any electoral accountability. There's no more presidential elections in his future. So what does he do? His first major policy announcement, so it was actually done at my alma mater in the beginning of 2013 at Georgetown Law School during his second term, was to make this big public announcement to order the Environmental Protection Agency to work on a nationwide climate plan. And what did the agency ultimately do? After a few years, it ultimately proposed and promulgated a nationwide, in essence, a nationwide emissions trading scheme, aka a cap and trade scheme. So let's recap what I just explained. Congress in Obama's first term, they had considered and ultimately rejected a cap and trade. And this is a big policy. This is it's an in fact energy rationing scheme. So it's a big deal. President Obama ignored climate change during his 2012 re-election campaign, won re-election, turned around, and then among his first measures was to start the process of imposing a cap and trade. And honestly, that's the policy we'd be under now had Hillary Clinton won in 2016. But what any one president can do, a subsequent president can undo, and President Trump, I think this was a sound move, ultimately undid what the Obama administration had rolled out. But that's neither here nor there. My point is that Congress had considered this huge policy, had demurred on it, and then the president turns around and imposes it. So that's wacky. That's not the sort of scheme that the founding fathers would have envisioned. Okay, so let me get to my next slide. All right, I don't want you to think that I'm just picking on Democrats here, because the Republicans really haven't been much better. I'm an equal opportunity offender on this score because they both deserve it. So let's look at another recent example, or a more recent example. And here I'm talking about funding for the wall along our southern border with Mexico. This is a famous campaign pledge by President Trump. As you've no doubt learned, so this is context, as you guys no doubt have learned in college and high school even, again, this is Con Law 101. One of Congress's most important constitutional authorities is the power of the purse. The people's representatives are supposed to be the primary decision maker when it comes to spending money. Okay, so with that context in mind, in 2018, Congress and President Trump had a disagreement about how to spend public money. Trump wanted funds for his border wall. The House of Representatives at that time, controlled by Democrats, disagreed. Both sides played hardball. You guys, certainly you're not too young to remember or to not know of the government shutdown in 2018. That was all attendant to these hardball negotiations. They shut down the government. Ultimately, the president gave way. The shutdown ended when the president signed a law that did not include any money for the wall. Okay, so Congress, power of the purse, has a disagreement with the president. Ultimately, Congress carries the day. The president signs this appropriations bill into law. Merely months later, Trump achieved his wall funding. So he declared a national emergency and reprogrammed existing funds. I'm not making a policy commentary on either climate change or immigration here. That's not my point. The wall, that's not my area of expertise. Regardless of how you feel about either policy, there's something pretty wrong here. Quite obviously, Congress is not wielding the power of the purse. The president did so. That's strange. That is contrary to how things were supposed to work pursuant to the founders' design. Okay, and so those examples, those are really the tip of the iceberg. Policy overwhelmingly today emanates from the executive branch rather than Congress. And I'll get to some specific numbers in a bit. But first, I want to discuss why. I mean, what's going on here? Why is Congress this second fiddle in today's policymaking environment vis-a-vis the president? When the founding fathers thought, again, Congress was going to be this impetuous vortex that we had to watch out for. So that gets me to my next slide. Bear with me. Okay. So you guys are too young to remember this, but this, when I was your age, when I was college age, let me get back to my other screen. This was a huge infomercial. It was for this the rotisserie chicken oven, and it had this famous tagline: "Set it and forget it." The whole idea is, it was marketed to dumb, and you guys are, relatively speaking, smarter than I was back then. But they were marketed to doofus college kids like myself back then. The whole idea is you put a chicken in, you set it, you forget about it, and a few hours later, bam, you've got delicious rotisserie chicken. Unfortunately, Congress has done something similar with its constitutional authority. And what works for chicken doesn't work for the Constitution. It's a problem. So specifically here, Congress has given away much of its lawmaking power by setting up these regulatory agencies and then forgetting about them. So allow me to elaborate. What am I talking about here? I'm talking about the administrative state. During the Gilded Age in the late 19th century, Congress started creating regulatory agencies with the authority to control, to limit private transactions and private behavior. So what was Congress thinking back then? Well, as you're no doubt aware, as you no doubt learned in history class, the Gilded Age was a period of dramatic economic expansion, of dramatic modernization, of rapid modernization. And attendant to that, there was societal disruption, and for better or for worse. In this context, in this environment, people wanted government intervention, wanted government action. Congress, could have rendered these potentially policy decisions by itself, but it had a sort of a natural incentive, as does any politician, to pass the buck. So what does it do? What does Congress do? This is back at 1887 when it created the first regulatory agency, the Interstate Commerce Commission, to regulate railroads. That was the first of many. But from thenceforth, from 1887 through the 20th century to the present day, Congress has created an alphabet soup worth of regulatory agencies that you've no doubt heard of. FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, that's one of the earliest ones. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, when it was first founded in the New Deal, it was to regulate hydropower, and it's since morphed into all sorts of new roles. The EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, the CFTC, the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, and so on and so forth. No doubt you've heard of these entities. Collectively, these domestic regulatory agencies, all this alphabet soup worth, is known as the administrative state. So every time Congress creates one of these agencies, the legislature gives away a piece of its lawmaking authority, gives away a piece of its power. That's the source of these agencies' regulatory power. I mean, these agencies aren't imposing rules on us out of thin air. What they're doing is they're exercising pieces of authority. This process is known as the Delegation of Authority, of Congress's authority to these agencies. They're exercising authority imparted by Congress. So at first, Congress, when it was creating these entities throughout much of the 20th century, in fact, basically from 1887 to 1979, really, Congress took pains to oversee these agencies that lawmakers had created. For much of the 20th century, again, it was actually powerful committees that were performing this role. So committees these standing committees in Congress, Energy and Commerce is a famous example. The House Judiciary Committee, I'm sure you've seen their hearings on TV, but they had jurisdiction over these regulatory agencies. And committee chairmen during this period were just as powerful in terms of managing regulatory agencies as was the president. I mean, these agencies would answer both to the committee chairman in Congress and also the political leadership in the executive branch. I mean, it was very much a competition going on. Back then, there used to be norms in Congress. This will blow your mind. Back then, you were expected in Congress to abide the specialization and apprenticeship norms. By this, it is meant you entered Congress as a new guy, as a new man or woman. You put your head down and you joined a committee and a subcommittee, and you specialized. You didn't say anything. All you did was study and gain expertise in a narrow area of policy within your committee's jurisdiction. And you were expected to do that for years before you were given any authority to oversee these agencies, in effect, or skin in the game, if you will. Now compare that to today. I mean, it wasn't but 3 months in Congress before the phenomenon known as AOC, this Green New Deal, that it's a pretty expansive program, but that would have been unheard of throughout much of the 20th century. Congress was just a different institution. Congress, members of Congress, they were policy experts. It's a different context. So over the last 40 years, this has changed. And Congress's oversight capacity is atrophied. I mean, it's like you break your arm and it's inside a cast, and 6 weeks later you take it out. I mean, it's withered. There's a lot of reasons for this, but for why Congress's oversight capacity is withered. But the big one is really the rise of political parties as the central organizing principle or a central organizing unit in Congress. So when Congress created the administrative state, so most Congresses throughout the late 19th and 20th century, until relatively recently, they had 3 institutional priorities in mind. The first would be Congress as a whole. They took pride in the institution of Congress. The second was the committee. The committee was this sub-unit whereby they wielded a great deal of authority. And the third was their political party. And all 3 of these institutions sort of won an equal amount of respect from lawmakers. That's not how it is anymore. I mean, things have changed. Now it is all about the party. Now, the average lawmaker has one and only one institutional priority. It's not Congress, it's not the committee, it's rather Republican or Democrat. And that's a problem. What that means is that at any given time, half the legislature, by this I mean either the Republicans or the Democrats, are uninterested in oversight of these regulatory agencies because their guy, their woman, either a member of their party is in the White House. They support these policies. To return to my examples to sort of make this point super duper stark. Oh God, it's 2:26. To make this point super super stark. 2013, Obama's State of the Union address. When he presaged, when I was talking earlier about climate policy and how he imposed this cap and trade, in his State of the Union, before he went to Georgetown and announced that he was going to do that, he says to Congress, he says, if you don't immediately pass a cap and trade, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it unilaterally with my phone and pen. And you know what? Congress, a rational response would have been outrage. But what did he get? He got a standing ovation from half the room, from Democrats. That's sort of where we are. Where, this atmosphere whereby party trumps institutional pride. And again, the Republicans are no better when it comes to the wall funding, the example I was talking about earlier. That Congress took a vote to try to override the president's, is kind of circumventing the power of the purse. And Republicans overwhelmingly sided with the president. Even though the president was, in essence, spitting in the face of Congress's institutional prerogatives. It wouldn't have been that way in the past. Okay, so that's the last 40 years. This sort of dynamic whereby the party has become the central unit in Congress, and concomitant with that, we've seen a decline in congressional oversight. At the same time that's happening, at the same time Congress is waning, the president is waxing. And by that I mean every president since FDR has ever tightened the presidential grip over the administrative state. So while Congress has been taking itself out of the game, every single president, they're layering authorities. They're standing on the shoulder of giants. But by that I mean, every president is building upon the power accretions that the prior president had done. They're of one mind here, presidents are, of getting more power and more control over these domestic regulatory agencies. So the upshot is we've got this present imbalance today. Again, over the last 40 years, Congress has sort of receded, and the president has very much gone to the fore, such that we now are in this time of presidential administration. The president is the policymaker in chief. Okay. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, okay, Will, who cares? Why do we care about this? And I'm going to tell you why. Really, there's two reasons, and they both pertain to how this current status quo I've been talking about really works at cross purposes with with these measures, these safeguards that the founding fathers have put in our Constitution. So what am I talking about? The first thing I'm talking about is Congress's evident lack of ambition. So no doubt you've all read Federalist 51. It's probably the most famous of the Federalist Papers. That's the one when Madison lays out the separate but competing powers of government. And again, this system is animated by ambition. Ambition is made to counteract ambition. That's the way the system is supposed to work. Congress and the president competing away. What I've described above is an alarming absence of ambition by Congress when it comes to the desire to compete with the president. It's a breakdown of competition between the political branches, and that's troublesome. Again, this competition is meant to safeguard our liberty. By butting heads, these political branches of government are supposed to limit government and thereby afford greater protections to our individual liberties. So to the extent that Congress is subverting this constitutional design, that's a problem. Okay, so that's one. And a second and related issue is that regulations are a lot easier to pass than laws. Here I'll quote Federalist 62. So in Federalist 62, I think that one was Madison. Don't quote me on that one, but in Federalist 62, we were warned that an excess of lawmaking is a disease to which our government is most liable. Remember, the founding fathers, they were government skeptics. They were skeptics of state power. They sought to limit state power, federal and state power. For this reason, the Constitution makes it hard to pass laws. Statutes must be passed by both chambers of Congress and then signed by the president. It's an arduous journey. People my age would remember that famous "How a Bill Becomes a Law" Schoolhouse Rock commercial. So by contrast, it's way easier for a president to impose a regulation. All the president has to do is pick up the phone to get the ball rolling. And here the proof is in the pudding. Last year, President Trump is a deregulatory president. Last year, regulatory agencies issued, 18 rules with the force and effect of law for every law passed by Congress. Over the last 20 years, I think the highest was 2011, Obama. It was 61 regulations promulgated by agencies for every law passed by Congress. Quite clearly, policy these days, domestic policy, is flowing from the executive branch. And that's not how the system was supposed to work. What I meant by there was the ease of lawmaking should be disconcerting to us. Again, if the whole purpose of making it difficult to pass laws was to protect our liberty from this disease of excess lawmaking, then by the same token, it's commensurately disconcerting that the president can issue these laws by picking up his phone or picking up his pen. So those are the reasons that you ought to be, or that at least I and liberty lovers out there ought to be concerned about this status quo about which I've been talking. I mean, in essence, it's undermining these constitutional safeguards. It's undermining the way the system is supposed to work, and the whole point of the system is to protect our individual liberties from overbearing government. All right, how are we doing on time? All right, so what do we do? What's the solution here? How do we make Congress great again? How do we get them back in the game of this, what's supposed to be a forever, perpetual competition among the political branches? The good news is that perhaps Congress's hand will be forced. So forever, for as long as Congress has been giving away its authority, this process of delegation, creating these regulatory agencies, the Supreme Court has refused to police the boundaries of these delegations. There's evidence now that that's changing. The new composition of the court, there appears to be a critical mass of 5 justices that sort of for the first time in at least 80 years are willing to revisit whether or not there ought to be some limits on the extent to which Congress can just devolve all this power to these regulatory agencies. So something to keep an eye on. It is possible that Congress's hand might be forced, that they might be forced to revisit some of these statutes, laws, and take some of these decisions upon themselves. On the one hand, that could occur. Let's see. On the other hand, there's any number of institutional reforms that Congress could pass to empower itself so that it could better compete with the president. And here, the most obvious one is to correct Congress's anemic staffing. Believe it or not, Congress's staffing levels are basically what they were in the late 70s. The government's gotten a lot more complicated since then. And the reason this is so, the reason that Congress is woefully understaffed, I mean, we got 2.4 million people in the executive branch, thousands, literally thousands of PhDs and JDs in the executive branch. And Congress is starving itself. And it's doing so because of myopic politics. Because since the mid-90s, unfortunately, it has been the prevailing politics of Congress that they demonstrate to the nation that leadership by starving themselves. I mean, notwithstanding the fact that they're, spending ever greater amounts of money on the executive branch, that they're trying to make some sort of point by starving themselves, and that's got to end. So a great first place to start in terms of Congress empowering itself to get back in the game and compete with the president, to make Congress great again, would be to just get staffing levels up to a reasonable level. So investments there. I think Congress spends $4 billion. That's the legislative budget, and that includes things like the Capitol Hill Police and the architecture, the U.S. architect or whatever his name is, who surprisingly wields a bunch of powers. Neither here nor there. The upshot is they're spending a drip in the bucket and on themselves relative to what they spend on government, and it's just I'll wrap things up super quick. So there are any number of institutional reforms Congress could take to empower themselves, but at the end of the day, the old adage goes, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. To the extent Congress obviously isn't going to take on any measures to empower themselves and get the system working as it was supposed to work until they sort of overcome this defect whereby party loyalty trumps institutional pride. So at the end of the day, what we might need is a new type of legislature. I mean, we might need the American people to wake up and say, hey, the people who are, or the 535 people we've got there now, perhaps they're not doing it right. And we need sort of a new spirit here. And one cut from the old cloth, lawmakers like they used to be. So I'm sorry that went on a bit long, but questions, please.
You did great. And most of the questions, just to give you a heads up, a lot of them are about what would you do specifically to handle this problem. And I'm going to disappear and come back when your Q&A time is over. So thanks.
You bet. Well, you're I guess I'll go to the questions to, pardon me. What would I do? So that was what I was getting at, the sort of measures that I've got a laundry, but check it out. If you check out my page at Cato, you'll see any number of writings about possible policy ideas that Congress could take to empower itself, from the addressing its anemic staffing levels to something called the legislative veto, which would basically allow Congress to check regulations that are promulgated by these executive branch agencies. They're all out there. But, as I was getting at with that horse to water adage, the will has to be there. I mean, Congress is going to have to get beyond this notion that whatever is good for my party is best. We need lawmakers of old who thought of Congress as Article 1 of 3, as a big deal, and they took pride in that, and they were very protective about their turf vis-a-vis the president, and then they battled with the president to manage these agencies, and that's really what I'd like to see. Whether the current crop of lawmakers comes to the realization that, hey, we should start respecting ourselves, or whether or not it takes a whole new 535 lawmakers, preferably from the Libertarian Party. But however the case, what I'd like to see is a return to past behavior. Congress that cares about the institution of the legislature and seeks to compete with the president, that demonstrates ambition in line with what our founding fathers, that Federalist 51, all that stuff. So that's, in a perfect world, that's what I'd do. Now, in terms of further questions, let me check. Q&A. Oh, there we go. Public. Okay, I'm getting tripped up by technological. So Thomas, help me. I can't find any questions. I'm sorry. I don't know what. Do you just want me to continue in the vein of talking about?
Would you like me to read some to you?
Indeed. I'm sorry. Again, I'm a doofus when it comes to technology. So I can't seem to get the Q&A to show up. But please throw me another question if I've got time.
Okay. Do you think the 17th Amendment has any blame for the anti-ambitiousness of Congress?
Holy smokes! I mean, I got to get my Constitution. What 17th Amendment? Which one is that? I Articles 1 through 3 are very much my bailiwick. Sometimes Article 4. All right, let's see what the 17th Amendment. Senate of the United. The one that with respect to the Senate how we go about voting for senators. Did that have anything to do with our current No, wait, what was the question again? Are they suggesting that, because that was done, in the early 20th century at a time when, even though Congress was delegating regulatory authority to these agencies, at the same time, Congress still very much carried itself.
Is it making them unambitious?
Is it making them unambitious? No, I mean, I don't think that the timing doesn't necessarily work. I mean, what I'm speaking about with respect to the Congress's lack of ambition is really something that has occurred since the 80s. I mean, it was, to be perfectly honest with you, I can tell you exactly what happened. The parties used to be a lot more or not mixed. I'm sorry, the word tripped me up. But in the 1970s, we basically had the demise of Northeastern Republicans and Southern Democrats. And as a result, the parties became more homogenous. That is, a hive mind took hold. At the same time, opportunistic party leaders, and here, such as Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell or House Speaker Newt Gingrich, they took advantage of this onset of this hive mind to change the rules and thereby facilitate the consolidation of power under party leadership. So it really is a recent phenomenon. I mean, for much of the system, I'm not thrilled with the extent to which Congress gives away or delegates its authority to these regulatory agencies, and I very much welcome the Supreme Court revisiting its jurisprudence on that matter. But I can live with it as long as Congress still plays the game of oversight, as long as they're fighting with the president to oversee these agencies. And it's only in the last 40 years when they gave up that game for the reasons that I spoke of. In essence, power centralized in both the House and Senate under party leadership.
All right. I'll give you one more. So, is it ever appropriate for Congress to delegate authority / the president to lead Congress on policymaking? Or did the current imbalance come about almost entirely unnaturally?
Oh, well, yeah, no, of course it's going to be necessary for some degree of delegation. You don't want members of Congress licking stamps all day, right? Like, that stuff has to be done. It's really the extent. I mean, it's like everything in life. The 3 drinks is fine, 20 drinks is not fine. Same thing with delegation. I mean, I would prefer to see more specificity with congressional delegations. The problem now is that I was talking earlier about the Supreme Court's really hands-off jurisprudence when it comes to these things. That this question of how much power Congress gives away is that literally the public interest is a definite enough mandate from Congress to a regulatory agency. That's considered, that there's no boundaries with that. I mean, that there's no when Congress says, hey, regulatory agency, work in the public interest. I mean, what limits are there? So I would prefer to see narrower delegations where Congress actually puts some meat in the bone and where our elected representatives are the one making these super duper important policy decisions like the wall funding, like the cap and trade, as opposed to the unelected bureaucrats at all these the alphabet soup worth of agencies that go together collectively are known as the administrative state. Okay.
All right. Well, I got to wrap you up there because we're right up at the end of our time. That was great. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you.
Wonderful presentation.
You guys take care.
Thank you. And thank you all. Really, this has been a ton of fun. Brad Watson, if you can hear me, if you're sitting in the waiting room, enable your camera and hop in. In the meantime, I'll say a few things to you guys. First off, let me know how you like that talk. Let me know, how everything's working out for you in the chat. And also, if you have any government agency that you would get rid of, the number one government agency that you most want to completely dissolve, let me know in the chat. Beyond that, if you are watching right now on our Facebook live stream, there is pinned to the top of the comment section, there's a link to the registration link so you can join us in the webinar. That's a good way to use all the tools, including asking the professors questions in the Q&A. And it's also a good way, and there's possibly polls, handouts, other chatting with one another. Lots of perks to that if you're in the Facebook group. If you're watching on the webinar, jump on your Facebook quickly and share that link to that Facebook page. Brad Watson has joined us. So I guess without further ado, I'll move on. Dr. Watson, I don't know if you've been watching, but I have moved from my normal, you're used to my hilarious anecdotes as introductions, and I have switched in honor of the format to memes. Let's see. I think this is the one I picked for you. Let's see if it works. Oh, it's sideways. Okay.
Like my whole life right now, sideways.
Yeah, no kidding. Everything not saved will be lost. Nintendo quit screen message. This is the most Brad Watson's. Let's see if I can flip it. Oh, whatever. It's the most Brad Watson meme I could possibly think of, I think. Reason I picked it. apart from thinking it was very funny, is that I think it kind of symbolizes something about who your next presenter is. So Will Yeatman got a "Don't Tread on Me" meme because perhaps he's worried about government getting into his space. But I think of Brad Watson as someone that is concerned about the enduring things and is worried about overreach of progressivism, destroying some of the congressional prudence that we have built in advance. So I don't know if you think that's fair. You will have the ability to rebuke my meme when you begin talking. In the meantime, I'm gonna read your introduction. Bradley Watson is professor of politics, holding the Philip M. McKenna Chair in American Western Political Thought at St. Vincent College in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. He's the co-director of the college's Center for Political and Economic Thought, Research and Public Affairs Institute, dedicated to scholarly expansion of freedom, Western civilization, and the American experience. He is, most importantly, probably a senior scholar at the Intercollegiate Studies Institute and a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute, and has served on boards of directors in several organizations, including the National Association of Scholars and the Philadelphia Society. He's authored and edited many books. I will highlight two of them: Living Constitution, Dying Faith, Progressivism, the New Science of Jurisprudence, Jurisprudence, Civil Rights, and the Paradox. Oh, yes. Yeah, no, that's right. Then it ends with Jurisprudence. Highlight that one because it's published by ISI. You can find it on isibooks.org. It's my shameless plug. And I'll also highlight the other one that you probably want me to highlight, which is
I do.
Progressive Challenges to the American Constitution, A New Republic, is your newest book. So hot off the presses, I'm sure he'll tell you about it, and sounds like it's extremely relevant to today's talk anyway. I'll also add that he contributed various journals, including Armed Forces and Society, Claremont Review of Books, Intercollegiate Review, Modern Age, those are the most important ones, National Review, and Perspectives in Political Science. Dr. Watson was educated in Canada, Belgium, and the United States, and holds degrees in economics, law, philosophy, and political science. So, Dr. Watson, I'm going to hand it off to you. If you don't get to the Q&A on your own at 3:20, I will jump in and remind you. But if you do get to it on your own, then you'll be hearing from me at 3:30 when your talk officially ends. So, thank you, Dr. Watson.
Thanks, Thomas. Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me? All right.
Yeah.
I am going to hold up a book, which actually this is my most recent book. Thomas missed it. It's Progressivism, The Strange History of a Radical Idea. Just came out from University of Notre Dame Press. When I say just, I mean about 2 weeks ago. All my book talks have been canceled, so you should buy this book and give it to everyone you know, because right now there's a pandemic of non-sales thanks to coronavirus. So I'll also say that I'd be happy to have the "Don't Tread on Me" meme. It's on the back of my truck. I'm comfortable with that too, although the one Thomas chose for me works as well. Let me begin by noting that I've already received many requests concerning my talk with you here today, but I'm going to go ahead and give it anyway. You're stuck with me for about 30 minutes or so, though in this format, you can get up and grab yourself a beer, and I won't even know about it. I'm tasked with speaking to you about the administrative state and the American regime. I'm going to use the occasion to offer, I hope, a broad constitutional sort of regime-level framework for thinking about the origins and implications of the administrative or regulatory state broadly conceived. I think it's fair to say we live very much in the clutches of the administrative or regulatory state. And we kind of take it for granted. And in addition, the regulatory state is, more national than it is merely state or local, although it's certainly both nowadays. I want to test your knowledge of the regulatory state, the administrative state a little bit. Last I checked, these things were true. Did you know that under the U.S. Code, it's a crime in a recreation site in a national forest to wash a fish at a faucet if it's not specifically designated as a fish washing faucet? This is actually true. Did you know that if you make onion rings out of diced onions and do not label them as such, you're in violation of a section of the Code of Federal Regulations as generated by the FDA? And just as importantly, did you know this, that the word made from diced onions shall immediately follow or appear on a line below the words onion rings? And they have to be 1/16 of an inch in height on packages having a principal display panel of an area of 5 square inches or less, et cetera, et cetera. I can go on with this. I'm not making it up. Don't kill the messenger. I'm just here to inform you. But let's not leave out the important work of state governments in this too. Did you know, due to recent legal changes in the state of Colorado, residents may now harvest rainwater? That's right. If you're a Coloradan, you can actually harvest rainwater. That is, as long as you don't harvest too much. Each household, I think, can harvest no more than 2 barrels per person. More than 2 barrels would require a permit, and the said rainwater can only be used for certain purposes. Did you know in Mississippi, Chapter 29 of the state code dealing with crimes against public morals, if a person shall profanely swear or curse or use vulgar and indecent language in any public place in the presence of 2 or more persons, he shall on conviction be fined not more than $100. And again, I'm here to help. So it's a good idea to get your expletives out of your system now before you visit Mississippi. So go ahead and start cussing, especially after another 25 minutes or so of my talk. You will want to do that. Most of these regulations, some in the form of statute laws, others in the form of regulatory, shall we say, discretion, are surprising to most people. Most would argue that some of them are dumb. Some would argue that all of them are dumb. And a case, I think, can be made on either side, but I'm not going to try and resolve those kinds of disputes today. What I want to do is suggest they're not all bad regulations, at least in the sense I'm going to use bad. My general point is that regulations that are consensually adopted, mostly at the state and local level by the people whom they are designed to regulate for the sake of maintaining, health, safety, morals of the people, aren't bad in the strong sense. They might in some cases be inefficient, they might be too costly, they might be imprudent, or they might simply be mistaken, but they're not bad in the strong sense that I want to use bad. And I think the American founders would have agreed with this. The founders were not libertarians or even classical liberals. They were constitutional Republicans. They believed there were such things as good regulations. Bad regulations, by contrast, are those that undermine the conditions of self-government and constitutional maintenance. These are regulations most often generated by what we sometimes call the administrative state. And I think a little bit of constitutional history is necessary to make my point clearer. My argument has 2 basic parts. The first offers a little historical context to show the political and moral elements of constitutional legitimacy and constitutional maintenance. And they include things like consent of the governed, separation of powers, which Will mentioned, decentralized administration, and what I'll call the cultural conditions that underlie political liberty. And the second part of my argument suggests ways in which these 4 things are undermined by the modern administrative state. And I want to start by spending a little time on an event and a document that proved to be very important to the founders' thinking about legitimate roles and limits of government. Just over 800 years ago, I think you're seeing it behind me, King John met his barons in an open meadow, a place called Runnymede between Windsor and Staines, a little to the west of the city of London. And there he was forced to accede to a document whose significance really echoed across the centuries, particularly in America, whose founders were steeped in English constitutional history. And it's no accident that the original 1215 Lincoln Cathedral Magna Carta spent most of World War II in Fort Knox, actually. That was lest the outcome of the war had been different than it was. That vital remnant, at least, had to be preserved. Nor is it an accident, though it is good fortune, that a 1297 exemplification of Magna Carta still sits in the National Archives in Washington, not far from the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. To this day, the only real marker at Runnymede, I was just there a year or 2 ago. Runnymede is still an open meadow 800 years later. It was placed there in the 1950s by the American Bar Association, nonetheless, which just goes to prove the American Bar Association isn't completely evil. It bears the simple words, Magna Carta, symbol of freedom under law. But in what sense could that be so? How can we say the barons, with their odd concerns in that odd time, that odd place, did anything to promote freedom under law, even for themselves, let alone for their posterity in England or, across the Atlantic in America. After all, they explicitly allowed all kinds of, shall we say, regulations, if you will, of their affairs. But they didn't think it was bad regulation. In fact, they thought it was good, even though much of it was regulation that we nowadays would find idiosyncratic at best or perhaps tyrannical at worst. I mean, for instance, Magna Carta proclaims that heirs may be given in marriage, but not to someone of lower social standing. Or further, people who live outside the forest need not in future appear before royal justices of the forest in answer to general summonses. Or here's one of my favorites. All evil customs relating to forests and warrens, foresters, warreners, sheriffs and their servants, or riverbanks and wardens are to be investigated in every county by 12 sworn knights of the county. And within 40 days of their inquiry, the evil customs are to be abolished. I love that. 12 sworn knights investigating and recommending. That's sort of like a super committee in Washington parlance today. And furthermore, what were those sheriffs up to on the riverbanks? Anyway, the mind boggles. What were the evil customs? But, and this is the big but of English constitutional history, which was so important to America's founders. A principle is enshrined in Magna Carta in writing that the king is not supreme, not fully sovereign. Magna Carta begins by insisting on the fact that the English church shall be free. Only that which is Caesar's shall be rendered unto him. And so the underlying moral structure of the universe is affirmed. The document, after all, insists that it commits what it does in writing for the health of our soul and those of our ancestors and heirs, to the honor of God and to the exaltation of the Holy Church and the better ordering of our community, of our kingdom. Magna Carta makes clear that the realms are separate, and in this separation, freedom is possible. Unification of all power, temporal and spiritual, is impossible. And in this tension is the possibility, I think, of freedom. But it's a freedom very much bounded by pre-existing moral laws and conventional laws. I mean, let's not forget those parts of Magna Carta which seem much more contemporary to us, I think. No tax may be levied in our kingdom without its general consent. A free man shall be fined only in proportion to the degree of the offense. And even in the most seemingly idiosyncratic passages, principles of natural justice have a way of shining through. No sheriff or royal official or other person shall take horses or carts for transport from any free man without his consent. Neither we nor royal officials will take wood for our castle or for any other purpose without the consent of the owner. And so we see the takings clause, if you will, in draft form. And that's not all. We also see the Sixth Amendment, Article 3, Section 2 in draft form. No free man shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his rights or possessions or outlawed or exiled or deprived of standing in any way, nor will we proceed with force against him except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. And I think one might even say that the FDA or the Federal Trade Commission, in a way, are contemplated. There shall be standard measures of wine, ale, and corn throughout the kingdom. There shall also be a standard width of dyed cloth. How about executive orders on trade and immigration? All merchants may enter or leave England unharmed without fear, may stay or travel within it by land or water for purposes of trade. However, this does not apply in time of war to merchants from a country that is at war with us. Or in future, it shall be lawful for any man to leave and return our kingdom unharmed, without fear, except in time of war, for some short period, for the common benefit of the realm. In other words, for short periods of time, the normal ways of going about things can be disrupted, as we are experiencing right now. So I think in the tensions enshrined in Magna Carta, themselves reflections of pre-existing practices, if you will, in a pre-existing spirit of liberty, you can find political freedom. Magna Carta makes clear that political and economic affairs may, in fact, legitimately be regulated, but only in accordance with the moral law and with the considered consent of those to whom the regulations apply. And appropriate exceptions for genuine exigencies as they arrive. This is not absolutism, but neither is it libertarianism or even classical liberalism. It is in nascent form, I would suggest, the freedom of a self-governing people to be self-governing. to govern themselves for the common benefit of the realm. And so it was more than half a millennium later that John Adams could speak of the spirit of liberty that animated all but the most corrupt Englishmen, he said. He was writing about a decade before the outbreak of the American Revolution. He said this: "Let us take it for granted the same great spirit which once gave Caesar so warm a reception, which denounced hostilities against John till Magna Carta was signed, which severed the head of Charles I from his body and drove James II from his kingdom. The same great spirit, may heaven preserve it till the earth shall be no more, which first seated the great-grandfather of his present and most gracious majesty on the throne of Britain, is still alive and active and warm in England." And even before that, well before revolutionary times in America, by the 17th century, these concerns were animating the Americans. The Massachusetts Body of Liberty of the 1640s brings together in a single document the liberties appropriate to a self-governing people, drawing on biblical and English common law sources. It established a precedent for the Bill of Rights, which would come about a century and a half later. The charter forbade the punishment of any man except in accordance with the established law of the land, promulgated by elected magistrates, and guaranteed equal protection of the laws, trial by jury, as well as the right to elect general officers of the jurisdiction. Women had remedies against disinheritance from deceased husbands or from physical abuse against living ones. Religious liberty was protected insofar as people were free to gather themselves into a church of state. The charter says, "Every church hath full liberty to exercise all the ordinances of God according to the rules of Scripture." The charter was by no means libertine. Regulations supporting self-government were considered both legitimate and necessary. Those actions thought to undermine the moral discipline necessary for self-government might be punishable by death, including sexual crimes. As John Winthrop maintained, "No man hath liberty to do what he lists. It is a liberty to do evil as well as good. This liberty is incompatible and inconsistent with authority and cannot endure the least restraint of the most just authority. Civil liberty amounts to having the liberty to do that which is good, just, and honest." By the 18th century, the founders' awareness of America's robust 150-year experience, really, with local self-government in the colonies, which were far removed, after all, from Crown and Parliament, as well, I would say, as their reflections on English constitutional development and their reflections on political theory, led them to conclude that all men are indeed created equal, and because of this fact of nature, are permanently entitled to self-government as of right, rather than a mere dispensation. And this thought, I think, can reasonably be traced ultimately to the Christian natural law tradition, as well as to the English constitutional tradition. In other words, to broad Western intellectual and cultural developments that were ultimately supportive of political liberty. Certainly, the English constitutional tradition contained broad hints of natural rights thinking, at least since Magna Carta, I would suggest. And the common law developed for centuries in a way sympathetic, even if sub silentio, to the idea of natural rights. The common law certainly has had much to do with protecting the rights of people from arbitrary power, after all. One of the most remarkable facts of the American Revolution, I think, was that it was fought in large part to maintain the English legal system, which the colonists thought was threatened by the practices of Crown and Parliament. "We demand our right to be independent, but we also demand to preserve your legal system, our legal system." It's a very unique kind of revolutionary thinking. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, Americans spoke and acted as if they believed people ought to be free to pursue what is appropriate to the reality of their political and moral nature, including especially the acts and arts of self-government, but not free to do that which is contrary to their nature. At no point do people exist as purely self-interested individuals. The moral law is real and we can know it. Our forms of government are matters of reflection and choice. If the founders, I think, moral concerns have nowadays fallen by the wayside in American politics, it's because we have rejected rather than embraced their natural philosophy. Their natural rights theory did not lead them to embrace atomistic individualism, but rather a vigorous conception, I think, of the common good, which included the necessity of promoting through law the intellectual and moral habits that were conducive to the preservation of political liberty to their posterity and to the encouragement of citizen virtue, on which such liberty depends. They understood that the laws of nature and nature's God must superintend the pursuit of private interest, and the maintenance of the republican form of government, in turn, depends on citizens who have republican souls, if you will. Such citizens cannot be merely self-interest maximizers. The founders understood their natural rights theory not as an affirmation of self-interest, but as the framework for the protection of the equal rights of all. In short, duties, some of them enforced by law, necessarily go along with rights. Government in the early republic required or encouraged the performance of moral duties. When it came to the moral conditions of self-government, the founders' natural rights theory had a distinctly, let me call it for shorthand, a distinctly communitarian, or one might say regulatory side to it. As an early Massachusetts law proclaimed, a general dissemination of knowledge and virtue is necessary to the prosperity of every state and the very existence of a commonwealth. Like love and marriage, rights and virtue go together like a horse and carriage. They're not competing traditions requiring some kind of uneasy amalgamation. The institutional constraints of the Constitution, far from showing the founders' lack of concern with virtue, show their great concern with limiting the dangers of selfishness in aid of securing republican liberty for all. Checks and balances, separation of powers, the extended sphere. In other words, the mechanics of the Constitution are necessary, though insufficient, conditions for liberty under law. Broadly speaking, this meant that government should be supportive of religion while respecting the rights of conscience, should encourage the teaching of the natural law, should frame wise laws to punish violations of the natural law, and should be concerned with shaping public opinion in support of virtue and in support of political liberty. From explicit supports for religion, including public prayers and invocations of God, to public educational systems dedicated to the promotion of religion and the understanding of the laws of nature and the formation of moral opinions, governments and political actors could not be said to be hands-off when it came to the conditions of self-government. For example, there was broad consensus on the need for laws that encourage marriage as the institution that would multiply, preserve, and improve the species. And functionally, I think this resulted in a kind of don't ask, don't tell policy on sexual immorality, but along with various legal encouragements to stable marriage and discouragements to bearing, for example, children out of wedlock. The fact is, I think the founders were not averse to regulation when it came to economic affairs either. Their economics favored private ownership, market freedom, sound money, and was very far from legitimizing either selfish acquisition or unrestrained government. This was evident immediately in the politics of the early republic. As one scholar has recently noted of this period, provision for the poor, the building of roads and highways, promotion of education, subsidizing of private enterprise, could all be categorized as service activity. State and local governments were extensively involved in these areas. And they also regulated the use of property so that it would not interfere with the property rights or safety of others, including restrictions on time, place, manner of conducting commercial activities. The federal government even got involved in this, probably around the Jacksonian era, becoming involved in public health and safety regulation, including everything from steamboats to drug inspections. All this points, I think, to the fact that the founders and what might be called the consensus American understanding that they established were, in contemporary terms, as I've said, neither libertarian nor liberal. First and foremost, the founders knew that the basic duty of government was to protect citizens, especially from attack, but from other physical threats. And for this, a certain amount of economic independence and prosperity are required. Everything from protective tariffs to limits on immigration and naturalization might be required to fulfill that duty. In short, economics rightly serves political ends. So the virtues of self-restraint, self-government, and self-assertion were all the objects of government policy for the founders, but for different but complementary reasons. They were all aimed at the securing of natural rights. The founders were anything but modern-day libertarians, I think. And this understanding of liberty, and therefore the legitimacy of constitutionally adopted regulation of human conduct, was a constant in America, really from Puritan times to the progressive era. And this is now the second part of my argument on how the things I've talked about, that is to say, consent of the governed, separation of powers, decentralized administration, and the cultural conditions that underlie liberty, how these things have been undermined by the modern administrative state and its various species of regulation. With the advent of progressive political philosophy, I would maintain, regulation did not somehow all of a sudden become legitimate as if it had not been before. It instead became bad in the strong sense of bad. Three things happened as a result of the intellectual movement known as progressivism that moved regulation into the bad column as opposed to something that is merely an inherent facet, let's say, of human life together, of political life. The first thing that happened is that regulation became less consensual, less responsible to the people, because more and more of it was not the product of the legislative judgment of the people's representatives. Instead, regulation was and is, and will before me talked a fair bit about this quite wisely, I thought. Regulation was and is increasingly generated through the non-consensual mechanisms of the administrative state. That is to say, bureaucracies or commissions to whom legislatures have delegated vast amounts of authority. And in its exercise, this regulatory power is often more concentrated because these individual bureaucratic entities frequently combine powers. That is to say, legislative, executive, and judicial power that should properly be separated. We have, in short, I think, sacrificed self-government and separation of powers in return for the purported expertise and efficiency of administration, something that Tocqueville, in his defense of the messiness of American democracy, cautioned against. Secondly, regulation has become relatively more national, less local. Progressives were and are suspicious of actual diversity as they are of local political control. So they argue for centralization and nationalism in the form of the modern state, especially the modern federal national regulatory state. Third, regulation has become, I think, less concerned with the moral conditions of self-government, and we nowadays consider, legislation on those things as kind of verboten, less concerned with those things, far more focused on matters of economic justice or merely the physical health and safety of citizens. How big your glass of soda can be, where you can smoke, and if you can smoke. As if the latter, health and safety, can be promoted in the absence of the former and the conditions of self-government itself. All of the above characteristics and goals of the early intellectual progressives were quickly assimilated and adopted under the auspices of the New Deal and the Great Society, and they're still very much with us today. More so with each passing year, as about 15,000 new regulatory restrictions, that is to say legal mandates, are added annually to the Code of Federal Regulations. That's well more than 1,000 a month, every month, more than 40 a day, every day, including statutory holidays. We now have well more than 1 million in the federal code. No one, literally no one, can know what they all are. The vast extension of police power that we've witnessed in our own days, such that it interferes at multiple levels with broad economic and political freedom, is a function of the progressive rejection of the founders' natural rights constitutionalism. This, I think, is what we must fight with every ounce of energy and political prudence we can muster. But I would suggest we should not do so with an insistence on ideological consistency or utopian perfectionism or a confidence that one political institution or approach can solve all of our problems in this regard. We will simply never get, it seems to me, perfect efficiency, perfect distributive justice from regulation. Of course, we can and should never stop tinkering at the margins to more closely approximate these things, but we have to recognize regulation will always be the result of political compromise, right? And sometimes outright political corruption. We must recognize once again, as our founders did, that all economy is political economy. What we can get and what we as free citizens of a constitutional republic really must demand is not perfect or even economically optimal regulation, but regulation that ceases to be bad in the sense that it violates constitutional norms and undermines the rights of self-government. Regulation, if it is to be not bad and maybe even good, has to be directed to these matters. Economic efficiency or the incentive structure created by regulation is not the only test or even the primary test. All economy is political economy. We need to be concerned about proper constitutional roles and limits. So while we don't have a libertarian or a classical liberal constitution, it is also the case that we manifestly do not have one that sanctions the unaccountable, unelected administrative state either, nor one that sanctions national control over fundamentally local matters, whether that national control be in the form of executive decree, legislative assertion, or judicial supremacy, which is another manifestation of centralized progressive control nowadays, in some ways the most striking manifestation. To the extent that we've come to believe the Constitution does sanction or even require such things, it's due to the progressive reconfiguration of the founders' political philosophy, really, for the sake of progressivism's own utopian nationalism. We cannot look, I think, to any one branch of government to do this for us, including the judicial branch, to solve this problem, which is a problem in a way of political thought as much as anything else. And we can't look to any one branch, largely because our elites are so much a product of that political thought. I think especially, the folks who go to law school and end up on federal courts. It's up to us, and ultimately to our educational system, wherein I think this organization, ISI, stands as such a beacon of hope. So, just to kind of end on this note, I think I have about 2 minutes left in my formal allocation. What's my solution to all of this? Well, the first thing I would say is we have to become Jeffersonians again, in a particular sense, not necessarily all-encompassing Jeffersonians, but take seriously enumerated powers, right? Take seriously that our national government is a government of delegated, enumerated powers. Reinvigorate the central facet of our Constitution, the Article 1, Section 8 list of legitimate legislative powers, and let us not go too far beyond that. Secondly, non-delegation. Demand that Congress and state legislatures legislate. Don't simply delegate everything to unaccountable bureaucratic agencies. Thirdly, vigorous constitutional, and again, this is tricky because so many people who end up on courts are a product of progressive legal thinking, but it would be awfully nice to reinvigorate judicial oversight of administrative agencies, of excessive legislative delegation. To have courts make sure agencies aren't exceeding their mandates under a reinvigorated Congress, a Congress, once again, as Will said, that asserts itself, right? And fourthly, I think legislative restructuring of administrative agencies to ensure they don't exercise too much legislative or judicial power. I think my time is up. I'm going to stop there and figure out if I can, or see if I can figure out how to answer questions. Thank you.
Okay, so you might not be able to see the Q&A section. I've been told that not everyone can see it. So I thought I would maybe ask you questions.
Yes, go ahead, Thomas.
Great. So this is one is from Nicholas Silva. So thank you, Nico, for asking a second and shorter question for me to read. He writes, what is your ideal for proper congressional regulation in the mode of the founders look like?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first part of the ideal is that Congress has to do much less, and in other words, stay within enumerated powers, number one. And secondly, and related to this, really, when Congress does less, it can do what it does much better. The fact of the matter is Congress, the national government, the federal code, federal regulations are so voluminous now, it's impossible for Congress to even figure out anymore, in a way, what it needs to do in terms of legislative oversight, in terms of non-delegation, in terms of ensuring that administrative agencies don't exercise, all three powers of government. So Congress needs to do much less. We need, in other words, to reinvigorate a sense of the proper balance of the federal system in American politics. So I want a constitutional Congress. A constitutional Congress can be an effective Congress. The unconstitutional Congress we have now cannot be. It simply can't be effective. It's just doing too many things. We look to the federal government for far, far too many things. So we have to reinvigorate a sense of constitutional limits, enumerated powers, which is why I said, first and foremost, I think a Jeffersonian sense of enumerated powers is probably the most important thing, right? Non-delegation, judicial oversight, legislative restructuring. In a way, they all assume that Americans take seriously, again, the idea of enumerated powers rather than plenary powers of Congress, of the national government.
Right. Well, Harry Clune asks a question that I share, which is, how do you decide what regulations are too much and overbearing? Mm-hmm. Is there a general standard that can be used, or is it more situational? Yeah, very good question. I think under the American system, or really under, I'm tempted to say under any system, but certainly under the American system, the fact of the matter is there isn't simply one cookie cutter standard you can apply to every law and every regulation to say whether or not it makes sense, whether it's prudent, whether it's cost effective, right? They all have to be looked to on a case by case basis. But there is a kind of broad standard that we can talk about, we can come to reasonable conclusions on, I think, as to whether a law or regulation is constitutional. That's a different question, right? And I think a more limited and a more sort of cognizable question than simply, does this regulation make sense in the circumstances, right? Which always depends on the circumstances. Or does this law solve the problem that we now face, right? Is this law good or bad? Is it too expensive? Does it go too far? Does it not go far enough? Those are all prudential decisions which depend on, particular circumstances. However, the thing that we must reinvigorate in order to have, sort of prudential arguments over, a limited number of laws is the sense of what's constitutional in the first place. And just a vast amount of legislation and regulation, I think, nowadays is really unconstitutional for the reasons I've tried to articulate. So, and when you get to the standard of constitutionality, I think there are ways of adjudicating that, right? You look to enumerated powers, you look to the text, logic, tradition, structure of the Constitution, right? You figure out what's legitimate and what's not. So we need to reinvigorate a sense, again, I think, of the founders' Constitution, if you will. That's the first. The prime directive in all this. And we're still going to have, and when we do that, even when we get laws that are, that I would say are perfectly constitutional, let's say, a state regulating something or other, undoubtedly, I am going to say in many cases, in my state of Pennsylvania, the virtuous Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is a good example of this. In many cases, look, this law is stupid, it shouldn't be on the books, but I'm also willing to allow it's a constitutional exercise of state authority, right? But that's a different kind of question. I think, the question of constitutionality is a more limited question. And then also, if we engage that question and realize that much of what the national government does is in fact unconstitutional, then a lot of the legislation sort of comes down from the clouds, comes down to the state and local level, where we can more easily, more readily, as self-governing citizens, engage the question of whether or not it's prudent. And believe me, here in Pennsylvania, there are a lot of dumb laws, including our Stalinist liquor distribution system, which is now entirely shut down thanks to coronavirus. It's becoming a true public health emergency in my household. So, but the question of prudence always depends on the circumstances and whether, the good of the people is genuinely being pursued. But that's a different and more circumstantial argument than I think the question of constitutionality, which good constitutional scholars, frankly, can give us some pretty definitive answers, I think, on what the Founders' Constitution really allows. Right. And luckily for you, everybody that's in this chat is certainly going to buy your book, which is I think James Davenport posted a link to in the chat.
Excellent.
Let me ask you this question, which came up last speaker, and if we answer it, then maybe it won't come up again, which is, do you think this current COVID-19 panic is indicative of the administrative state? If so, how? This is from Andrew.
Okay. As far back as Magna Carta, I'll go back to the beginning of my talk, right? As far back as Magna Carta, there's a recognition that in really unusual times which threaten the kingdom, which threaten the Commonwealth, a certain amount of, shall we say, regulatory or executive discretion is necessary. You know, when can merchants be allowed to conduct their business in the Commonwealth and when not? Well, if we're at war, then, you know, maybe all bets are off. And to the extent that a global pandemic really threatens not just the livelihoods, but the lives of citizens, I think most people are willing to say there's a certain amount of, executive discretion that has to be exercised to prerogative, let's say, even. Prerogative by definition goes beyond law, right? Prerogative fills the gap either where there is no law, which might be the case in what we're dealing with right now, or where there is law, but somehow something needs to be done even contrary to or over and above law. But hard cases make bad law, right? I mean, difficult exigencies really can set bad precedents. I'm very concerned. I've been concerned all along, and I keep asking the question, what is the constitutional authority for this, that, or the other thing? Or at the state level, when a governor orders, say businesses to shut down, what is the legal authority, either the state constitutional or statutory authority to do this? I have yet to see clear answers in the case of Pennsylvania. I do think that Americans should be, and it's the nature of Americans to be this. Americans are not, Singaporeans. They're not South Koreans. Americans question authority. I think we will do this and muddle through. I am concerned about setting bad precedents for basically unlawful activity in times of crisis, right? I mean, this is a real concern. We should be raising these questions. I think at the federal level, actually, there's very little constitutional authority for, say, a president to shut things down. There's more of a general, a genuinely legitimate police power when it comes to states, acting in these areas. Less constitutionally suspect, that is, although it might be suspect on prudential grounds. And I'm starting to think that, some of these shutdowns are suspect on prudential grounds. So I think there's real dangers whenever there's a national crisis like this. But so has it always been. There have always been these dangers in times of crisis. But as I say, I think Americans are more attentive to these things. It's the don't tread on me spirit, the Gadsden spirit, if you will, which keeps us attentive to these things more so than other peoples, including other citizens, I think, of advanced industrial democracies. Many citizens of other countries, because of different, the different natures of their foundings and sort of different understandings, if you will, of compliance with authority. I think other peoples are more willing to just go along. I think Americans not even in the long run, the short to medium run, are going to start pushing back against things they think go too far. But there's no cookie cutter answer to this. We're willing to go along with it for now, but how long will we be willing to risk our livelihoods, our economy for something which we, the people, start to think isn't quite as dangerous as some of the political authorities tell us it is. So this remains to be seen.
Great. Okay. 3:30 on the nose. Well done.
Great. Thank you, Thomas.
Thanks a lot to Brad Watson. And everybody go order his new book, the one that I incorrectly named. But
Please
you can
do.
find it in the chat. Okay. Well, thank you. And Anthony Campau, if you're listening, please enable your camera. And I'd like to thank everybody that's still with us, especially those of you that have been with us this entire time. It's been really a lovely way to spend the afternoon for me. Why don't you leave me in the comments this time, if we are going to get rid of government organizations, where would you like the power to go if you had to pick a branch of the government? Do you want a more powerful legislative branch, a more powerful executive, or a more powerful judicial? Let me know in the comments, and then we'll talk about it. Don't just say the states. That's a freebie. Hello, Mr. Campau. Okay, and Jason Jewell has already said the states. Thank you, Dr. Jewell. Okay. If you are watching on our Facebook Live, please check the comments and join us in our actual webinar, where you can use all the webinar tools and actually communicate with the speakers and ask your questions, as well as communicate with us, the attendees. If you are watching on the webinar, maybe go to Facebook Live and share that video, so that way it can get around to more people and we can have more people join us. And then just another reminder for you guys, if you use the chat to talk to each other, and especially use it if something is not working and you want to let us know, but use the Q&A to ask questions that you might have for our speakers. And then it looks like maybe only administrators can actually see the Q&A section, so I will just jump on and read them to Mr. Campau. And for those of you who are new, I'm no longer doing my usual shtick during introductions. I'm instead using memes. So this is the meme that I chose. Let's see if this works for Mr. Campau. Let's see if this is the right one. It's sideways. Actually, this one is fittingly sideways. So it says, it's a quote from that Clickhole attributes to Michael Jackson, which says, when I am doing the backwards walk, don't worry. I'm just doing it for entertainment. In real life, I know how to walk forwards. I have a weird sense of humor, so I just thought that was a very funny Clickhole bit on its own. But it reminds me of Antony Campau, who's making it his life's work to deregulate the government, which you might think is a step backwards, but he is fully aware of exactly how it's a step forwards. You like that? Thank you. Thank you. Okay.
That's awesome.
All right, now I'll do your actual real life introduction. Antony Campau is a fellow of the Thomas Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation. He was formerly chief of staff and counselor at the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, otherwise known as the OIRA, long regarded as the most, quote, the most powerful office you've never heard of. Also serving as the beachhead team at OMB and OIRA, and as a core member of the regulatory reform team on the presidential transition team. Campau has helped to develop executive orders, policy memorandum, and guidance used to implement President Trump's regulatory reform agenda. In addition to his previous service at Heritage Foundation, Campau has a JD and LLM in securities and financial regulation from Georgetown University Law Center. He also served as a law clerk to the Honorable Naomi Rao in U.S. Court of Appeals, District of Columbia Court. So it's quite a resume. He's worked right in the middle, in the thick of things. So now you'll hear from the insider's perspective on how we need to dismantle the administrative state. Mr. Campau, your talk ends at 4:05, at which point, I'll take this meme down. At 4:05, at which point I will jump back in and start reading you Q&A questions. So thanks, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Thomas. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Thomas. Thank you to ISI, and thanks to all of you for joining the conference today, for the distinguished speakers who came before. I'm very excited to be here having this conversation with you today. I think it's an incredibly important topic. I'm glad you're all interested in it, thinking about it, and hopefully working on it now and in the future to make improvements. What I wanted to do just briefly this afternoon is kind of give a little, what I think of as a primer on regulatory reform, how to implement reform. Before jumping into the primer, I thought maybe I would just give a quick kind of recap, sort of start with a punchline of what's been accomplished over the last 3 years, because you don't hear about it too much. It's not, doesn't get a lot of press coverage, maybe gets a line here or there, not a whole lot, but I think it's important as we talk about how to get something done to just say upfront, a lot has been accomplished over the last few years. We have a long ways to go to get to the constitutional government discussed earlier, but a lot's happened already. In the first few months, the first fiscal year of 2017 of the administration, we eliminated 22 rules for every new regulation and saved on net $8.1 billion in regulatory costs. That means that we went from every year for decades having an on net cost imposed on the economy of billions of dollars to actually going down through the x-axis and saving money on net, net of $8.1 billion just in those first few months of that first fiscal year. And we also took in that first year 1,500 of the 3,000 or so rules that were in the pipeline for the future. There's this process called the Unified Agenda. It's all the rules across the entire executive branch that people are working on that are going to come out over the next year, 2 years, 3 years. Had 3,000 rules in it. We took half of them and either pulled them out of the system or we delayed them by several years to give us an opportunity to think more about them. So that isn't even cutting an existing regulation. That's just cleaning out the pipeline of all the stuff that's to come in the future. So just some enormous steps just in that first year. The second year, we went from 22 to 1 to 12 to 1. There was some criticism that we weren't doing apples to apples, that we were only looking at significant regulations on the kind of new reg side and all kinds of activity on the dereg side. So we did a full apples to apples of significant to significant regulatory and deregulatory actions. Even when you do that, we were 4 to 1 with a $23 billion net savings. And in 2019, we went to 4.3 to 1. And then if you do that apples to apples at 1.7 to 1 with $13.5 billion in net savings. In total, just under $51 billion in total net savings for the first 3 years, with expected to be just over that in 2020. Because if you think about the kind of the regulatory process, it's incredibly time consuming. So in the first year, we were getting a lot of low hanging fruit, cleaning out the pipeline. The second year, proposing a lot of new deregulatory actions. And the third and fourth year is really starting to finalize those deregulatory actions. And so you're just now entering a phase where we're finalizing the biggest deregulatory actions, which will result in the biggest cost savings. So then jumping into a primer, I think it's important, just 5 points I want to hit. I think it's important to have clear direction from the top, strong leadership at the agencies, strong teams, strong individual staffers and middle management, and an understanding of the process. And that last part is where I think we will spend the most time. But I think just up front, I think it's important to note as we think about how to tackle these problems, it's important that somebody, a president in our current case, comes out and sets a very clear tone and direction for the administrative state. He's not only the commander-in-chief, but he is the chief executive of the executive branch, and can really do a lot just by setting a strong tone for those agencies, for the agencies under his charge. And the president did that with the executive order that become known as the 2-for-1 executive order that says for every new regulation that we issue, we have to get rid of 2 old ones. That had an enormously positive effect. Many people criticized it when it came out. They said it was poorly drafted. It was a blunt instrument. How could this possibly work? It will never work. I think part of the reason they missed it is because they focused on the 2-for-1 aspect of it and not the second part, which really gets a lot less attention, is the cost cap mechanism. So the regulation, in addition to saying 2-for-1, says $0 in new regulatory costs can be imposed on the economy. 0. So it has to be on net. Now, you have to, of course, comply with all of the laws of the land. And so if the statute says, you have to, let's say we had a series of statutes that said we have to impose on net $100 billion in costs, we would have had to do that. We, of course, account for those kind of things. But where the discretion has been given to the agencies, $0 in new regulatory costs. And for 3 years running, the president has absolutely blown that away. We have achieved that goal very handily. And again, I think this gets little attention. but is pretty important. That clear direction from the top. We had a freeze memo that went out at the beginning of the administration from the chief of staff. We also had an executive order that set new task forces in place to manage the regulatory reform process in each agency. That was incredibly important. And so as you're a middle manager, you're in the trenches, you're working on things, you can point, you can say, well, I would like to help you. I think what you're trying to do is good, but the boss said 2 for 1. The boss said really charge forward hard to have a more rational administrative state, and gives you a lot of cover and direction for all kinds of smaller transactional issues. The next thing is strong leadership. It's very important to have secretaries, deputies, captains out there in the field who agree with that strong direction from the top, and who take and communicate it to their own staff and support it and don't try to undermine it. And we've had that across the board. Almost all the agencies have had very strong leaders focused on regulating in a rational way. It's not to say we've never regulated. We're not here trying to, destroy all of the regulatory system. We think it's very important to have clean air and clean water and a system that works and is fair. But we don't want it to be unduly burdensome. A lot of rules are out of date. They simply are. They make no sense today. Their time has come and gone, and they need to be reviewed and they need to be updated. And that's a lot of what's underway. So the strong leadership really helps to drive that home. What we saw in this administration is the president issues these executive orders, and then a lot of times the secretaries go out and issue their own memos to their agencies implementing the executive order for their agencies, strengthening the points the president has made, identifying how exactly you apply that within the agency to different issues, and then putting top people in the agency on the secretary's team on the task forces to help manage through the process. So that's a critical part. The strong teams is that third point. The policymaking process in the executive branch is incredibly dynamic. You see a regulation come out and you see a sub-office of an agency that's responsible for this rule, and you think, well, it's just that sub-office that developed the policy and implements it. Absolutely not. There's a huge conversation within government, all kinds of stakeholders who have technical expertise that bear on the subject matter, who have a conversation about the most rational way to regulate. And so having a team that sort of across the board, across all those different functions, has the right principles, the right motivation, the right objectives, really helps you to get reform. And I think in this administration, maybe as a Heritage partisan, someone who spent a lot of time at Heritage over the years, I could say my Heritage colleagues and sort of conservative movement colleagues from lots of organizations are in leadership roles across the entire government. Every agency has lots and lots of conservative movement staffers who are sort of rank and file people. So you're having a policy meeting with people from across the government. It's very likely that half or 2/3 of the room are people that you've worked with in the conservative movement over the years. And so those are really important things when you're trying to decide and debate. Having people who have a similar worldview to you, part of that conversation is really important. And then fourth point, I think, is just sort of strong individuals. You, at the end of the day, if you go into government work, it's important, of course, to have the right principles and motivation. You're here at this ISI conference today because you undoubtedly have that. You're learning, you're growing, and you undoubtedly have that. You have to develop a subject matter expertise and knowledge. Maybe you're an economist or a lawyer. Master your craft so that you can go in and participate at the highest level and as effectively as any person in your discipline can. And then I think the third part there, it's just critical at the end of the day. So many decisions, while there's a large group conversation, it often comes down to one person or a small group of people to make a decision at the end of the day. And it's important that you as an individual have the courage of your convictions to stick with it, to stick through difficult times or difficult decisions. We heard from a friend who worked in a previous Republican administration said, every one of these policy issues that you're working on now, when we worked on those, we always thought, well, how is it going to poll in this key state? How is this voting group going to think of it? How's that voting group going to think of it? And we were, pressure testing every part of the decision for how it would work electorally for us or for our allies. And they took passes on a lot of reforms that they probably wanted to implement. And this person said, when we left office, we still had low 30% approval rating, low 30s approval rating. People didn't like us, even though we spent all of our time thinking about how to make people like us. And she said, in this administration, it doesn't seem like you do that. And indeed, I think there are a lot of people in this administration who are focused on achieving reform, and they're not poll testing everything. The president campaigned on a set of issues and ideas. He talked about regulatory reform over and over and over. The president speaks to a group of farmers about WOTUS, just the acronym WOTUS, Waters of the United States. They all know what it is. They stand up and clap. They want reform of WOTUS, and they've gotten it in this administration. And so you have a lot of people across the board who are not afraid to hold the line and to make tough decisions and do what's right, even if it seems difficult. And I think that that's a key part of it. At the end of the day, you just have to do it. And then I think the big category here is to really understand the process. If you want to drive reform, you have to understand within the executive branch sort of how things work. A lot of the most important reforms perhaps are not in the executive branch. It's Congress has to take action. There's been a lot of discussion on that today. I think a lot of those ideas are great. We need less delegation of authority to the agencies, for example, less broad grants of discretion to the agencies. But once it gets there, and today we're in a world where the agencies have an enormous amount of policy-making discretion across lots of functions, what do you do? How do you change things? And so you've got to understand the process if you're going to drive reform and be effective. So I think there's sort of two buckets here. One is, what are all the processes that are currently in place? How is the policy made in the executive branch? And then second bucket is kind of what new things need to be added to that. And can you do it on your own? Do you have to have Congress do it? Does the court have to take some action? And so the first bucket of what are the current processes in place for regulatory policy, which is basically all policy. Sometimes I think people think, well, there's healthcare and there's tax and there's a defense policy and then there's regulatory policy. Regulatory policy is all policy. It cuts across every policy function. It's the primary way. It should be the primary way policy is made. It shouldn't be made through adjudications. It shouldn't be made through enforcements. It should be made through regulatory policy. So the main executive order on this, you may know, Executive Order 12866, written by President Bill Clinton. It largely lifted a lot of the ideas from Executive Order 12291 from President Reagan, but made a number of changes, some would say improvements, but a lot of changes that got a buy-in from a lot of folks for how to issue rules. And then under that, there's an OMB circular called Circular A4, which lays out the foundation for cost-benefit analysis in the executive branch. These two documents work together to help us craft regulatory policy in every policy area. It requires agencies to think about what's the market failure. Is there a regulatory solution to this market failure? Are there alternatives to regulating? Are there regulatory alternatives that an agency can exercise? Those two allow my old office, OIRA, to pull basically a rule in. So if, let's say, the Department of Labor wants to issue a regulation for a particular kind of facility and how the employees need to do various things, they write up their first version of it, they send it to OIRA for review. OIRA takes that, they look at, they think about who else within the government has an equity in this policy. Does the Environmental Protection Agency need to be a part of this conversation to make sure the labor rule ends up the right way? Does the Treasury Department need to be a part of this conversation to make sure we end up with the right rule? We bring all the stakeholders within the government together to have a conversation, to share expertise, to challenge each other about the best way to proceed on the policy. So that mechanism allows for a broad conversation on a lot of issues across the government. It also, as I said, is where the basic architecture for cost-benefit analysis comes from that we use when trying to exercise the discretion we've been afforded by Congress. So if, we've talked about these broad grants of discretion, an agency can, maybe Congress said, solve the climate change problem, and we're not going to give you any instructions how to do it. You figure out how to do it. The agency has enormous discretion for going about trying to solve that problem. What tools can they use? Cost-benefit analysis is an exceptional tool for figuring out what are the economic effects of each of the policy choices we could make to solve this problem, and how do we make the best choice. And then run it through the system and have all the different government stakeholders see, did you do it right? Can they think about some cost or benefit or transfer effect that you didn't think about, and incorporate that into the conversation. The Paperwork Reduction Act, this is a statute that basically says that all forms have to go through a certain process, including going to OIRA, my old office, for review, because we don't want unnecessary paperwork. And it's another kind of, what we're talking about is just a series of hooks into policy making. So a policy comes out on some labor policy for manufacturing facilities, let's say, and you've got all kinds. You've got the 12866 hook, you've got the Paperwork Reduction Act hook into it, you have an Information Quality Act hook into it is another one. The Congressional Review Act is another hook into that policy process. The Regulatory Flexibility Act, it says you can't unduly burden small businesses or a significant number of small businesses. So all of these, basically they're requirements. There are red tape on agencies as they try to regulate. So Congress has passed a number of these statutes, and previous presidents and this president have written a number of executive orders that say whenever the government's going to regulate, you have to check all these different boxes. And all those boxes are a series of steps and processes that impose obligations on the agency to make sure they're getting it right. And so it's important to just understand each one of those. And we don't need to go through them in exhaustive detail today, but it's important to just think through what are all of those steps that an agency has to take to get the policy right. And then as you think, if you're an economist, let's say, or you're a lawyer, or you want to go into some area of policy, think about all of those hooks and how you can participate at each one. So the Paperwork Reduction Act, for example, gives you kind of a bite, to mix metaphors, gives you a bite at the apple. So let's say you had a fight on a rule, you're a regulated party or something, you have a fight on a regulation, you submit a comment on a proposal, your comment gets rejected. The form that implements that rule is another bite. A lot of the time, the form itself is what gives life to the rule, and nobody pays attention to it. There's very little conversation on that form, but there's a whole notice and comment process around each form that the public can weigh in on and help to drive policy. All of these, there are a series of other ones. All of them have some basic principles undergirding them: transparency, public participation, fair notice, due process, and those are all critical principles. And then you layer on top of those. In this administration, we layered on top of most of these new guidances and new processes. So we took the Unified Agenda process laid out in Executive Order 12866, and we put all the president's deregulatory agenda on top of that. So as we went through each agency to figure out what are all the rules they're going to issue over the next year, 5 years, we ran them through the deregulatory framework that the president laid out. So we built on top of these existing structures and tools. So we added Executive Order 13771. I mentioned the 2-for-1 EO, the Task Force EO. We wrote a guidance on the Information Quality Act to strengthen it so that we make sure that all data undergirding rules is robust, is strong, is verifiable, is transparent. For the Congressional Review Act, the statute's been around a long time. There's been a guidance document on it for a long time. We strengthened that by adding a new guidance document that clarifies for all agencies, including the independent agencies, that they need to analyze the effects of their policies so that OIRA, an old office, can make a determination about whether the rule is major before it goes to Capitol Hill. Seems like a small point, doesn't maybe make a lot of sense to people why that matters, but it really matters. Giving an office, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, the ability to take a look at every rule to see whether it's major. What does that mean? Major is $100 million of effects or more, a number of other possibilities too, but that's the key one. So how do we know if it has $100 million of effects? We need some tally of costs and benefits and transfers. And when we have that, we can start to have a conversation about what is actually in the rule. Instead of an agency just issuing it, we can say, well, this has $200 million of effects. Are you sure? Have you thought of all of the different effects it could have, and really get them to put a more robust analysis in the rule, allowing OIRA to make a determination, and then Congress to make their judgment, their determination about whether that rule should live or die under the CRA. We put in place a new review process building on 12866 for Treasury rules. So all tax rules now, significant tax rules, go through that process. So just bringing in another set of regulatory activity into the ordinary process. And the same thing with these guidance executive orders that have recently come out. You may have seen we did 2 new executive orders on guidance. One says we're not going to regulate through guidance, and another says we're not going to bring enforcement actions against you based solely on your violation of sort of so-called guidance. So this is kind of just trying to take all kinds of quasi-regulatory activity and pushing it into the normal regulatory process, which has all kinds of protections in it for the public. It's imperfect, but the democratic process plays out best in Congress. So you don't like what your member is doing, you can call him or her, you can write him a letter, you can go visit him in the office and say, I don't like this and I think you should change it. When an agency issues a rule, what do? Of course, we have notice and comment process on a proposed regulation, but if you regulate through guidance, you don't get that chance. And so we've tried to you try to regulate through enforcement actions effectively. You try to take all of that extra activity and push it into the ordinary process with transparency, with public participation, with fair notice, where people get due process, and you get a more fair, just, rational system. And then a whole series of executive orders that are sort of in this bucket of new processes laid out on each policy area that, again, tackle energy or environmental policy and try to do these same things we've just been talking about. So I think basically, if you're not talking about Congress, you're talking about the executive branch, to get the kind of reform that we've seen over the last few years that we started with talking about, you really have to have that clear direction from the top. Everyone knows what their marching orders are. You've got to have it from the president and within the agencies. You've got to have strong teams and colleagues across the administration. You have to stay strong, and you need to really understand the process. It's important to have good ideas and the right values and principles that motivate you. But if you don't know where you can actually plug in and do something with that and drive reform, then you're not going to be able to drive the kind of reform that that you're seeking. So I guess I will leave it there, and I look forward to talking with you about whatever questions you might have. Is that okay, Thomas? Are we ready to jump into that?
Yep. Okay. This is a great talk, by the way. You've had a really interesting career. Let's start Jillian Kinder. Jillian Kinder, by the way, would never miss a Pittsburgh conference, even if it is online. She's been to, I think, all the ones she could. And so she asks you, how would you sell the ideas of limiting regulations to someone who is undecided about the role of government or who is leaning toward larger government?
I'm sorry, of eliminating regulations?
Of limiting regulations.
Limiting regulations.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, I think I think that at least in Washington, I worked with a lot of career staff across the government, many of whom I'm sure did not necessarily agree with this big grand, regulatory reform, reform the administrative state agenda. Mm. But what we did was we talked about, and I think it's very fair, and I very much believe this, trying to have a rational government that's fair, that's transparent, that's accountable. I mean, we know a lot about Congress. If you go by, if you drive through Washington on Christmas Eve at night, all the lights, this is maybe a silly example, but all the lights in the congressional offices are off because no one is there. And if they were on, we would all probably give our member of Congress heck for, wasting our taxpayer dollars, leaving the lights on, leaving the air on, whatever. You drive by a lot of the, not anymore, by all the agencies, the Metro lights are all on, everything's going. There's very little accountability. We don't know who's there, what they're doing, like you do in Congress. You have to have more accountability. You have to have more transparency in government, and especially in all the important policy-making functions. And so a lot of what we're doing is we're just going back and looking at rules that are out of date. I mean, the president's been talking about it recently with COVID-19. A lot of the rules are just out of date. He's not attacking them. He's not saying the people were horrible people for writing the rules that they wrote before. He's just saying they're out of date. They need to be updated. They need to be fixed to account for the issue today. That's a lot of what we're talking about. And as you update them, maybe you don't regulate for, and I don't want to speak specifically to the issue today, but a lot of regulations in the past are around a specific technology or a specific standard around a specific solution instead of a standard or a principle that you could use for a longer term. And so something like that, those regulations get outmoded fairly quickly and create all kinds of problems in short order. And there are all kinds of new proposals in the pipeline to regulate for a new specific technology. It just doesn't make sense. They don't last and they have to be redone. And it's an enormous undertaking to redo a rule. So I think it's just about making government more rational, making it more constitutional, making it more accountable, making it more transparent. Who wants the executive branch exercising discretion with tools that we don't, that nobody knows about? It seems like edicts. It seems like just, people in Washington doing whatever they want and not really having any accountability to us. We want the executive branch to use cost-benefit analysis to make informed, intelligent choices. We want there to be public participation through notice and comment, so that it's not just edicts from on high. So those are the ways we've talked about it, I think, and we're able to encourage a lot of people to kind of come along and support us and partner with us who may otherwise have been not supportive or not collaborative in this work.
Okay. Okay. This next one is from Harry Clune. He asks, as you work toward deregulation, is there a part of the economy or an industry that should have more regulations than they currently do? Are there any regulations are there any regulations we should be adding?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one thing to think about is, whether you think this is a good thing or not, we don't have a whole lot of, for example, commercial drone use. We don't have a lot of regulations around drones, artificial intelligence, around vehicle-to-vehicle technology, all kinds of new technologies. They're not regulated, and so in many cases, they're not used en masse. Those technologies have pros and cons, but it's an area where I think a lot of people think you need regulation. What we did in the president's, in our guidance to the president's 2-for-1 executive order was we actually said regulations that are market enabling are deregulatory. So if you, for example, if we have a series of drone rules, which we worked on to make unmanned vehicles over people usable in the normal course of life, we're going to create a whole market out there of activity, or enable a market to exist. And so we consider that deregulatory. I think that's one area where a lot of people would say, you need regulation, otherwise you're just never going to get the kind of market activity. And that's not great. Maybe it's not great that we live in a world where you need a regulation to get market activity. But that is the case today. So I think that's an answer a lot of people would give.
Great. Okay, well, this next one is from Joshua, and he asks, should the federal government look to local and state governments to play a role in limiting regulations? I think that's been a relatively common question throughout the day. So
yeah,
for a lot of people, is it that easy? Is the states the solution?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's funny. So there's an executive order from President Reagan that actually requires federal agencies to think about the federalism implications of a new rule. So you've got to work with state and local officials, tribes, to make sure that you're not entering a space that a state is regulating in, or that if you're doing it in concert and you've sort of thought through it all. That is an executive order that has not been enforced, that has not really been followed for a long, long time, and I think is absolutely crucial to regulating in a proper way. And I think it's funny. I mean, I think a lot of people think federalism is great and we should let state and local governments do their own thing until they're in charge. And then when they're in charge, today, for example, there are some states who are out very highly regulatory, and maybe they're going beyond what people in Washington think should have happen. So, we try to control it centrally through the executive branch instead of allowing states to flourish and regulate. So it's a real challenge. Basically, I mean, no matter which side of the aisle you're on, when you're in charge, a lot of people forget about federalism. They forget about state and local government. And they just want to drive policy from the top. And I think that in many cases, that's a mistake. And often if we work together and we have these conversations and work collaboratively, we can get to policies that everybody can live with, instead of just sort of bulldozing people all the time.
Mm-hmm. Great. This one's from Victor. He asks, if it is believed that Congress is divided and influenced by politics, we the people, what are our roles in such a time? We don't all work for OIRA, so what can the voter do?
Thank you. I'm very glad for the question, Victor. I think one of the biggest challenges that I, as a conservative staffer in the administration, had was we're working on regulations, we're trying to reform some program, and there's a whole public comment process on a rule. So first you go out and you propose it. You say, here's what we would like to do, in 50 pages or 500 pages or whatever, depending on the rule. And then the public gets an opportunity to comment, to share their perspective, to share their experience, their expertise. This is an incredibly important part of the process. We do not have a king who issues edicts. We have a participatory process. And we need to engage in it. And by and large, in my experience, there's an enormous amount of engagement from the left, the political or philosophical left, and very, very, very minimal engagement from the right. And that is not helpful. So if you just think, I cannot tell you numerous times in conversation with folks from agencies as we're trying to reform a program, you would hear, well, we've got 15 public interest groups who all think that the regulation from the last administration was great. We have lots of companies who've written in saying it's great. They just want modest tweaks. And pretty much nobody is saying they want this program to be changed or eliminated, except, you crazy people, what's the matter with you? And so, we need air cover. I mean, your friends and colleagues and fellow travelers who are in there, they are getting, dirty and bloodied, and they're in the trenches fighting, and they need your expertise. If you're an economist, take one of these regulations, look at the cost benefit analysis, and think about it, work on it, see if they've thought of everything. You know, are they just looking at the static effects? Are they just looking at, how much does it cost to put the new, filter or muffler on? Or are they also looking at opportunity costs? Are they thinking about the dynamic ways this would impact the economy? Those are things that we could really use, and I implore all of you to think of. You can go to the Federal Register today, and you can pull up and you can see all the rules that have been proposed. There's a button at the top, current proposed rules that have just been published today, and look at them and see, are any of them in an area you know about? Do they impact something that you work on or think about or have experience with? And what can you contribute to that conversation? And as you think about the long run for your career, think about doing something that takes advantage of the opportunity to engage. A lot of countries in the world did not have that kind of participatory process. And I think to a very significant degree, a lot of the excesses of the administrative state of, some regulations that went way too far, it's because very few people, we would say someone would say, get rid of that agency, it's unconstitutional, but almost no conservative people will go in and actually write a comment going through point by point of the things I'm talking about, the individual hooks into rules and saying, oh, you said this doesn't impact small business, you certify that it doesn't impact small business, but I run a small business, or my parents run a small business, or whatever, and here is what it's going to do to us. And we're one of 5 companies like us in our state, and whatever in the country or in the region, and give them something to sink their teeth into. And then if they don't respond to it, if they blow it off, or if they give you an answer that doesn't work, then that gives you a hook to challenge it in litigation. If it's not in the docket, it doesn't count later on in litigation. So you've got to engage. For any comment from the right, there are 10, 20, 30 or more from the left, and industry doesn't fight back by and large. And I think that's one of the other common myths, is that a lot of times people who attack regulatory reform say, oh, you guys are just greasing the treads for big business. That's absolutely not the case. Big business often wants regulation. It often helps them. It creates a moat around their business and protects them from competition. And so what we're talking about is actually leveling the playing field, having it, making it easier so people don't have to hire lawyers and lobbyists to get going in a new area of business. And so a lot of that, as I said, on forms, on rules, each of those kind of hooks. You can go to reginfo.gov, OIRA's website, and you can read more about all these little hooks. They all give you a way to go in and participate in the conversation on the policy. And it matters. People look at that stuff. And they have to comment. Actually, under the Administrative Procedure Act, they're required to respond to every substantive comment that you put in the docket. If there's a form letter and we all fill out the same form letter and put it in, that doesn't matter. It doesn't do anything in the regulatory world. But if you write a substantive comment that gets in and talks about the law, talks about the economics, talks about the science, they're required by law to evaluate it and to give you an answer. And then you go and review it. Thanks for that. That's really important.
Yeah. And I think, it's just true that people that really like big government want to get very involved, and people that don't like big government don't want to think about it all that much.
That's right.
So it's really hard for more conservative or libertarian minded people to want to get involved. And I think a lot of them don't know how. So those things you said are helpful. That's your time. I got to say, it was really a great talk. A lot of the questions ahead of your talk were about, okay, we get it's a big deal. What are the solutions? So it's really great to hear what your solutions are. That was a lot. So
get involved. That's the most important thing.
Great.
Go be for an agency.
Right. All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Campau. If Jim Harrigan or Antony Davies, if you can hear me, you can turn on your webcams and come on and join me. Selena Zito has told me that she may or may not be able to make it. She was called kind of at last minute to cover a story. So she is trying to get into this on the road. But, luckily her role is to interview Dr. Davies and Harrigan and their pros especially at this particular talk, so they can, we'll see, do either do without her or do it maybe start without her possibly. Okay, so for everybody watching, especially those of you that have been here the whole time, I feel like I've really gotten to know you. This has been a lot of fun. And a lot of you I see every year at Pittsburgh anyway, and it's great to see that that you still love this conference. So thanks to everybody. Why don't you drop me a line in the chat about just how positive do you feel at this point in time after hearing those 3 talks, especially the last one? Do you feel like we're going to beat this thing? Do you feel like deregulation is on its way, or do you feel like or do you feel like it's only going to get bigger as government sort of is slowly going to advance forward, and we're just trying to apply the brake? And Dominic asks, when is hospitality? Dominic, you can enjoy hospitality from the comfort of your own home now. Just okay, I see Jim Harrigan seems to be coming online. For those of you watching on Facebook Live, especially those of you that maybe came on as fans of the podcast from Drs. Harrigan and Davies, if you're on Facebook Live, you should consider jumping into the actual webinar, which has all sorts of tools in it, including the ability to talk to our presenters and the ability to talk to one another in the chats. If you go into the Facebook Live comments pinned to the top, you'll see a link to register, so you'll be able to do the registration. For those of you who are just now finding your way onto the webinar, welcome. It's good to have you joining us. Please share that Facebook Live video if you can, and feel free to ask comments in the chat. If you have questions for our speakers, ask them at any point and drop them in that little Q&A column that's next to the chat. And so you can talk to each other on the chat about anything. You can talk about the video quality, those types of things. And then for your actual questions, we'll work through there. That'll be how that works. I will jump back on when it's time for Q&A and ask you guys the questions. We're going to keep going, I think, without waiting for Selena Zito, but she may just pop on at some point, and then we'll have to adjust. Okay, well, I'm going to finish up my final meme of the day for you guys. I chose this meme. Let's see if it comes in sideways. It does not. Okay, so we've got Make America, George Washington, which is what I think of when I think of this sort of a going back to the founding, but also going forward kind of at the same time, right? I mean, and so I think that's a lot of what we'll be talking about today, what you're talking about in your book. Was also a bit of an homage to Selena Zito. She does pop into this chat. She made her reputation by covering Trumpism in a way that no one else was actually covering it. This was back in 2016. So that's your meme. Welcome to 2020. We do memes now. That's what ISI has become. Okay, so I'm going to, without further ado, I'm going to give you both your bios and let you go. So I'll do Dr. Davies first. He is the Milton Friedman Distinguished Fellow at FEE, Associate Professor of Economics at Duquesne University, and co-host of the podcast Words and Numbers. Dr. Davies authors monthly columns on economics and public policy for the Philadelphia Inquirer and Pittsburgh Tribune Review, which, we're not in Pittsburgh, but emotionally, spiritually, we are in Pittsburgh. He has written a book on understanding statistics published by the Cato Institute and co-authored hundreds of op-eds for, among others, Wall Street Journal, LA Times, and Washington Post. His YouTube videos on economics, government, and policy have garnered millions of views. Which is good because we know he's good on video. In addition to his academic work, Dr. Davies was associate producer at Moving Pictures Institute, chief financial officer at Paramount Computation, founded several technology companies, and is co-founder of chief academic officer at Freedom Trust, where he lectures on economics for high school students across the country. So thank you for joining us, Dr. Davies.
My pleasure.
Dr. Harrigan is managing director at the Center for Philosophy and Freedom at the University of Arizona and the F.A. Hayek Distinguished Fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education. He is also the co-host of Words and Numbers podcast. We have with us both co-hosts of Words and Numbers podcasts. Dr. Harrigan was previously dean of the American University of Iraqi Salmani and later served as director of academic programs at the Institute for Humane Studies in Strata, where he's also senior research fellow. He's written extensively for the popular press, with articles appearing in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, U.S. News and World Report, and a host of other outlets. His current work focuses on the intersections between political economy, public policy, and political philosophy. Okay, so topic today is your new book, which is Cooperation and Coercion, published by Intercollegiate Studies Institute. You guys can all order it, isibooks.org. It's a great book. We recommend it highly, and it's a great publisher. So I'll let you guys go. You have until 5 o'clock, and then I'll jump on and do some Q&A for both of you. So over to you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Anthony, be entertaining. Go.
Say it again, James.
Be entertaining.
Geez, I'm having trouble with my sound. Once more.
That's because you're deaf. Be entertaining.
I still can't hear you. This doesn't matter, right? So we're here to talk about cooperation and coercion. James will say a few words. I won't know what he said, but I'll tell you a few things. We started this book many years ago. I think we've been at it for 6 or 7 years. And it started out as an attempt to document a bunch of things that people say about the economy that are just untrue. And when I say untrue, I mean untrue from a non-controversial perspective. Economists of the left and the right would both agree with this sorts of statements. And I put this together and showed it to James, and James thought it was horrible. And so we reworked the whole thing and ended up at this book, Cooperation and Coercion. And the premise of it is we begin from the perspective that virtually all human interaction falls under one, the other, or a combination of these two organizing principles, cooperation or coercion, where cooperation, of course, is people voluntarily coming together and doing things. People tend to think about market interactions, and those are, of course, cooperative, but it can be more than that. It can be choosing to join a club and the club choosing to admit you. It could be something as simple as you agree to pick up some groceries for your neighbor at the store. All sorts of things from the informal to the formal fall under this heading of cooperation. But the key element here is that any cooperative relationship requires the consent of both parties. Either party at any time can say, no, I'm not interested in this anymore, and walk away. So that's one organizing principle. The other organizing principle is coercion, wherein we force people to behave certain ways. And typically it's government that we think of, although it doesn't have to be government. Parents are coercive toward their children. I mean that in a good sense. You know, you don't want your child running out in the traffic, so you put restraints on the child or whatever it is. But coercion is any instance in which one person or group of people is enforcing their will upon some other. And if you begin to think of the world like this, that humans relate in either cooperative ways or coercive ways or some combination of the two, you start to see patterns that suggest that neither one of these things alone is the best organizing principle. Rather, there are some instances in which one organizing principle is better, other instances in which the other organizing principle is better, some instances in which a combination of the two is better. But the theme here throughout the book is that there is a better and a worse. That is, we can address certain problems that require cooperation in a coercive manner and get worse outcomes than we would have had we addressed them in a cooperative manner, and some vice versa. James, you want to jump in and say something I can't hear?
Well, let's be sure anybody can hear me. Can anybody hear me?
Oh, I can hear you. I could hear the voice. I just couldn't make out the words.
Well, so everything is exactly as it always is with me. So as Ant and I started to think about cooperation and coercion, we really wanted to frame this in a fruitful, productive way. And we asked some basic questions that we think people tend not to ask when they think about how we're best to organize ourselves politically, socially, however you may choose to view the phenomenon. And we started with this thing, the knowledge problem, where we asked a very basic question that doesn't get asked near often enough. How much can anybody hope to know? And when you really think about that, we started with Leonard Read and his classic essay, I Pencil, a very short, very simple essay that gets to the heart of this thing, the knowledge problem. Because Leonard Read in 1958, I believe it was, had a very strange assertion. He says there's not one person on the face of the planet right now, nor has there ever been in the scope of human history, who could make a pencil, and I mean just a simple everyday pencil, from scratch by himself. And that sounds like a fantastic assertion until you start thinking about it for a moment. And Leonard Read picked a pencil. I'll find a yellow one here, very standard issue pencil. And if you look at it, you can tell that there are only 6 component parts to a pencil. There's the wood, there's the lead, which is actually graphite mixed with clay, so now we're up to 3. There's the rubber in the eraser, the metal in the ferrule that holds the eraser to the body of the pencil, and some simple paint. 6 easy things. So ask yourself this: how many of those things could you make by yourself from scratch? And the answer is probably none of them. You might be able to fake up some paint, and you might be able to come up with clay. Ancient people living on riverbeds used to be able to make clay, so maybe you could too. But the rest of it, it's the from scratch part that makes it so difficult. And if you think it through, the first thing you would need clearly is wood. From scratch means you'd have to have a tool to cut the wood. The simplest tool would be an axe, and if you could hope to form metal into an axe head, you'd still have to get wood to make the handle. And you see where you're left here. How do you do this sort of thing? And okay, if you can't make a pencil, what else can't you do? What else don't you know? And that's a very, very wide-ranging and open question, because come to find out, most of us don't know much. We know about the things that impact us directly, but as you move out in degrees of separation from yourself to the larger world, it becomes less and less clear. If that's true, then the scope that we've got available to us for things like governance, probably radically different than we tend to think, right? And when we think about government and governance, we typically say, and you'll hear people say this all the time, there ought to be a law. We should do X. Well, ought implies can, and I think we've got some open questions here. What are we able to do is really the question we should be asking. Under the best of circumstances, what can we do and do well without massive failure, without massive unintended consequence that makes our lives worse, not better? Because remember, everything we do aims towards something better, not worse. Why is it so often the case that when we act collectively, politically, everything gets worse? And that's about where Ant and I stepped in. We took that as a guiding principle, and then we started looking at cooperation and coercion as they apply to human beings, as we apply them to ourselves in no small way.
And this knowledge problem, we tend to think of it as applying to government, but it doesn't only apply to government, it also applies to market relationships. I've noticed several people of late on my Facebook feed saying things like, well, this coronavirus thing is just evidence that we need to be self-sufficient, that we shouldn't be relying on other countries to provide various things. And that's the exact wrong answer, because that's invoking the knowledge problem in voluntary interactions. So, for example, it requires a tremendous amount of knowledge for me to be an economist and to communicate with you on this computer, right? I have to go very deep in this very narrow place. I don't have the knowledge to grow my own food, to refine my own gasoline, even to change the oil in my car. I rely on other people to do that. To ask that I be self-sufficient, that I be able to do all of those things, is ridiculous. I don't have the knowledge necessary. However, I can specialize in this one thing, and my neighbors can specialize in other things like fixing the car or growing food or whatever it is, and we exchange. And what happens is not any one of us needs to know everything. Each of us only needs to know a little bit, and then we exchange what we have for what we need. Now, if you understand that at the level of a neighborhood of me and my neighbors, you can easily extend it to the level of a city, of me and some business across the way. You can then extend it to different states, of me buying stuff that someone produces in Oregon. And then you can extend it to countries. And what you notice is the political boundaries are irrelevant to the economics. If it makes sense that you're better off trading with your neighbor for things that your neighbor's good at in exchange for things that you're good at, if that makes sense at a neighborhood level, it makes equal sense at a country level, because the economics is no different.
All right, so how do we connect this then through the knowledge problem to governance? That becomes the actual question, right, Ant? We've got to figure out those things that we need to do collectively, and there are a list of things that we need to do collectively. We may disagree on the nature and extent of that list, and people on the left and right clearly do. That there is a list, I think, goes largely without question. There are a few hardcore anarchists out there who say there's no place for government whatsoever. We're not those people. We do think that there is a role for government, but given the knowledge problem, government is definitionally constrained before we even have the conversation. Right? Before we decide what we would like government to do, we have to come to terms with what government can in fact do. And that's something that I think shoots by the wayside in most political discussions right now.
Yeah, government is not a magic wand, which is often the way we think of it. We see some problem and we say, well, the government should just fix this by imposing some new law. And the fact is that's largely not possible, again, because of this knowledge problem. It's easy to pass a law saying people should earn more money, except that that's not something that's actually within the government's purview. It can alter the wage rate, but it can't alter the underlying value of people's labor or what it is that people want from their neighbors. That has to come from the bottom up. It's a knowledge problem that the government cannot overcome. And therefore, this is an instance in which using government, at least using it in that way, is inappropriate. And I mean, you're walking into minimum wage category right now, something we cover in the book. So why don't you talk about minimum wage at least for a minute and discuss the unintended consequences, because everybody sees minimum wage. They rarely see the unintended consequences that emerge once government gets involved and creates a minimum wage in the first place. They do, and there's all sorts of misunderstandings here that feed into it. And if you trip over any one of the misunderstandings, you can easily end up falling into the camp of thinking, well, minimum wage is a good idea, when in fact it isn't. One of the things that people trip over is this idea that businesses have a tremendous amount of money, and all they have to do is just pay their workers more. And I think we come to that conclusion because as we go about our lives transacting business, we see revenues. We say the business's revenues. So you go to the store and the person in front of you is buying something. You can see them, sign the credit card or put the money on the table, and you come up and you do the same thing. And you look around, you see other people doing this. You write your rent check to your landlord. But in every single case, what you are observing is not profit, but revenue. This is the money coming in. What you're not seeing is the money going out. You're not seeing how much money the grocery store pays for the food that's on the shelves, to keep the lights on, to pay for the labor that comes in and cleans the place at night, all of that sort of thing. Such that when you put it all together and ask Americans, how much profit margin do you think the typical American corporation has? The majority of Americans say something around the order of 35%. The correct answer is about 5%. And even that tends to be atypical for things we typically deal with. You think about businesses like Walmart. Walmart brings in a tremendous amount of money in revenue, but its profit margin is around about 1 or 2%. Same case with your grocery stores. So when you simply say, all right, let's pass a law that requires a business to pay its workers more money, now you have a problem. Where's this money going to come from? Because in our heads, we're thinking, well, it's going to come out of the company's profits. Well, except the company's profits are close to zero already. There's not much that can happen there. So if you require that the company pay its workers more money, the money's got to come from somewhere. Where it comes from is either consumers in the form of higher prices, which kind of obviates the whole point. I want to help people by raising their incomes, but then the consequence is going to be that we're going to raise the prices of things they buy. Or, and this is the insidious part, or the money to pay for this increased minimum wage comes from workers who become unemployed because their labor is no longer worth what the minimum wage dictates. And here I say it's insidious because the workers who are predominantly hurt by this are the exact workers we're trying to help. Workers who are lower skilled, lower educated, lower experienced. These are the people that need our help the most. And yet this particular policy, I'm not saying we shouldn't aim to help them. What I am saying is this particular policy of minimum wage actually has the unintended consequence of directing the majority of the harm at those people that we're trying to help.
Right. And if you think this one through, following on Ant's observation that most people seem to think that businesses make about 35% in profit. And there are a couple out there that do, but that's really rarefied air. The vast majority of American and indeed global businesses make far less on a percentage basis. But now ask yourself another question. How many workers do you think make minimum wage as a percentage of the American workforce? And again, you're going to get this answer about 30% from most people most of the time. And yet that is so decidedly incorrect. It's almost hilarious how bad the response is. The actual number is just a shade under 3%. And it's even more profound than that, because of those people in that group, more than half of them are tipped workers who make quite a lot more than minimum wage once tips are factored in. So you're looking at a 1% give or take section of the United States workforce making minimum wage in the first place. Very, very few workers. And when you raise the rate, the disproportionate harm on the lowest grouping in that lowest grouping is so powerfully horrible that if a rational person were presented the evidence just on its face, not with the emotional baggage that comes with it, no one would choose to do this. Literally no one would choose to do this because the harm that's meted out is so profound. And who does it harm? As you drill through the data, it's not college graduates, it's not even high school graduates, it's people who didn't quite finish high school. Those are the most marginalized, at-risk members of the workforce, and they're the first ones to pay the price when we start monkeying about with minimum wage on a large basis.
And this is where coercion becomes a problem, because often when we use coercion, we focus on the outcome rather than the underlying causes. And so we say something like, well, people aren't earning enough to support their families, so let's raise these wages. And that's looking at the outcome. What is the wage? Cooperative interactions tend to focus on the causes. So a business will say to itself, look, I'm selling this thing that consumers want, and consumers are willing to pay a certain amount for this thing I'm offering. If I raise the price, they're not going to buy as much, right? If I lower it, then they'll buy more. And this is about the amount that consumers are willing to pay. Okay, there's a limit on how much I can charge for this. That comes about because of my interaction with the consumers. Similarly, if I've got a worker over here that can produce a tremendous amount of this product, then it's worth it to me to hire this person, because what I have to pay him ends up being less than what consumers are willing to pay for the thing the worker produces. And again, notice the focus. It's all at the ground level of the causes. What is this worker's labor doing for me in terms of production? What is this product doing for customers in terms of their satisfaction, their willingness to pay? And that's what drives the numbers. And if, when all the dust settles, the number isn't high enough for the guy to earn a living, the answer is not to focus on the outcome of his wage rate. The answer is to focus on the cause. And the cause is his labor simply isn't valuable enough. So if you want to help the guy, that's where you have to focus your attention. But that involves much more cooperation than you can get from a government that simply passes a law and says, let there be $10 an hour.
Right. And as we talk about this and you start to apply the same principles to other things, what you come to realize is that every time we find coercive governmental activity, and you can't really avoid this, right? Governments are authoritarian by definition in nature. But every time you see this kind of coercive force applied to people, you see unintended consequences emerging. And it's a little hard to see here in the United States in the 21st century when things are, roughly speaking, pretty good. I mean, it might be a lot easier to see in the last couple of weeks as things get a little worse here on the ground. But Ant, I'm wondering if you'll tell the people about unintended consequences as they played out in Venezuela after the nationalization of the oil industry. Yeah, because it drives the point home, I think, perfectly.
It's a fascinating tale. And unintended consequences, of course, are what happens when you use coercion to dictate how people will behave, and the people react to that coercion in ways that the coercers didn't anticipate, and odd things start to happen. So we start with Venezuela back in the, whenever it was, 80s or 90s, and the government decides to nationalize the oil industry. So of course, what this means is the oil companies that were regular corporations as we understand them and had stockholders and all of this, the government comes in and says that now all belongs to us. So stockholders go away, your stock is now worthless, all of the physical plant, everything belongs to the government. The government's going to direct how this company does what it does. So it's nationalized as the oil industry. And an unintended consequence emerges, which is that when you have stockholders who are taking a share of profits that these companies produce, the stockholders have a financial incentive to take some of the profit that the company earns and not take it for themselves, but redirect it into the company to maintain the company's physical capital, its machinery, its buildings, its oil derricks, the trains, the trucks, all of that stuff. And why would the stockholders do this? Because they understand that by taking away some of this profit that would have otherwise gone into their own pockets, putting it back into the company will be able to persist and continue earning profits into the future. So the stockholders have this profit incentive to plow some money back into the company, maintains physical capital. When the government takes it over, that incentive is gone. Now you can say, well, the government has that incentive, except the government isn't a person. It doesn't have an incentive. The government is comprised of many, many people, each of whom has different incentives, some of them actually contradictory. And it turns out that nobody in the government has that same incentive like stockholders do. And so what happened is, over time, the government stopped investing as much as it needed to in maintaining the physical capital of the oil industry. And so the capital starts to wear down. The trucks start to wear out, the trains start to wear out, the machinery requires maintenance, it's not getting, the oil derricks are now, parts need to be replaced, they're not being replaced, this sort of thing. And so the amount of oil that the industry is able to pull out of the ground starts to decline. And as that declines, of course, the government now gets less revenue because this revenue was belonging to the government. government gets less revenue, it has to do something. What does it do? It starts to raise taxes. It starts to borrow more. And it did as much of that as possible. And when a government does as much of that as possible, the last thing left is for the government to start printing money. So the Venezuelan government started printing money. And you got another unintended consequence, which is inflation. Prices start to go up. And so what happens is people start producing, complaining to the government that they can't afford food. So you go and the loaf of bread is now $10 when it used to be $2. You complain to the government, and the government says, okay, we're going to employ some more coercion here. We're going to apply a cap on the price of bread. You may not charge $10 now, you may only charge $2. And that creates an unintended consequence. The unintended consequence is the farmers can't afford to grow the wheat necessary to make the bread because the price of the bread is being held artificially low. Meanwhile, the things that the farmer has to buy to grow the wheat to make the bread are not controlled. Those prices are high. And so the farmers stop making bread. And so the unintended consequences, you go to the store and there's nothing there on the shelves. And so as the last resort, the government passes a law conscripting people to work on farms. And notice what's happened here. If you follow coercion like this to its logical extreme, the only way the government can get precisely the outcome it wants is to basically enslave the population, because that's the only way to prevent all of these unintended consequences from emerging.
Right. In the case of Venezuela, you're left with two very fantastic outcomes. The first one I just mentioned, slavery. It's literally slavery. When the government tells you you must go to work and you must do a certain task and you have no agency in the matter, that's the very definition of slavery. The second and odder, I think, outcome is that Venezuela sits on the largest oil reserve of any country in the world, and they can't manage to get it out of the ground. And that's where that first little bit of coercive activity ultimately got, because of the unintended consequences. So when we think of our own shared American experience, okay, we don't have anything that's that profoundly ridiculous. However, Antony and I in the book take up 3 wars that the United States has undertaken, not wars against other countries, but wars against what we call common nouns. And we've got 3 in our history that stand right out. The first is the war against poverty, instituted by Lyndon Johnson in the mid-1960s. The second is the war against drugs, which Nixon kicked off in the 70s. And the third is the war against poverty, or the war against terrorism, which we got under the second George Bush years. Well, okay, what are the unintended consequences here? They may be a little harder to see than chattel slavery in Venezuela, but they are actually quite evident when you start thinking about what happened. Okay, the war on poverty. Reagan came in the 1980s and said, we fought a war against poverty. Poverty won. I think that's actually the best way to start thinking about this, because after, 40, 45, 50 years of the war against poverty, why is it that we see poverty at roughly the same rate that we ever did? That's an interesting question, especially when you think about the level of bureaucracy that we've implemented to attack that problem. So think of every single federal, state welfare system that would fit the bill. Well, those are all funded by tax dollars, taxes which are definitionally coercive.
James, and if you get our book, which I highly recommend, James wrote specifically what is probably the best sentence I've ever read in this chapter on the war on poverty. And he lists all of the various agencies and programs the federal government has instituted to fight poverty in a single sentence, and it runs for 1.5 pages.
Of single-space type. It's the longest, most ridiculous sentence ever written. And if you read it carefully, it's actually one of the most heartbreaking sentences ever written, because those are the things that we tried to do to address a problem. Not one of those things worked.
Yes, right? The poverty rate has remained roughly constant since we started the war on poverty.
And it's not because we've changed our definitions of poverty, and very little has changed there. And that's heartbreaking. Now, if you jump to the war on drugs, well, okay, that gets us into the middle 1970s. And I think we may be seeing finally chinks in the armor of that with marijuana legalization reaching across the country and not being accompanied with a heavy social price as was predicted for so often. But why is it that 40, 50 years after Richard Nixon declares a war on drugs, they're still exactly as plentiful as they ever were? That anybody can walk into any town in which he has never spent a minute of his life and within 5 minutes find the drug supply. I mean, it's not hard. There are people out there right now who are thinking exactly where they would go in a foreign town. We've done absolutely no good here. And worse than that, we've imprisoned a raft of nonviolent offenders who, if they were harming anyone, it was themselves. And you have to ask some hard questions. Do we really want to imprison people for the crime of harming themselves?
And what's happened here with both the war on poverty and the war on drugs, we openly declared war on this abstract concept. Well, you can't fight an abstract concept. And so both of those wars evolved into wars on the manifestations of the concept. The war on poverty actually became a war on poor people. The war on drugs became a war on drug users and drug sellers. And this puts, one of the unintended consequences is particularly the war on drugs, puts our police in an untenable situation. So you talk about the problems that we see in relationships between police and citizens. In part, and I think in large part, this is due to the fact that we are asking police to enforce laws that most people consider to be on their face wrong. Now, clearly, if you've got a drug dealer who's killing people to establish turf, or drug users who are stealing from others to satisfy their habit, that's a problem. But the problem there isn't the drugs. The problem is the killing or the stealing. But for people who are harming no one else, what we have done is taken this chunk of something that they consider to be nice. It makes them happy, and we've made it illegal. We've asked the police to treat these people as criminals.
More than that, I think we've encouraged the police to frame their own lives in militaristic terms.
Yeah.
Right. When you say there's a war on drugs and then tell the police you're the warriors, we shouldn't be terribly surprised when warrior-like behavior emerges. And we see this manifest time and time again with, police barging into a house, shooting somebody full of holes, only to find out later they were at the wrong house, right? These sorts of terrible mistakes that occur. Well, they wouldn't occur in Andy Griffith's Mayberry, right? Where Andy didn't have a gun on his hip, but just the power of persuasion. And you think about the role that the law plays in yielding bad outcomes, especially I'm thinking about the war on drugs here. Well, what happens when you're in business, a legitimate business, and a competitor does something that he ought not do in a free market? You have recourse to the courts. Illegal businesses have no such recourse. So violence takes the place of the court system. There's a perfectly rational reason why it emerges. And if you legitimize those businesses, the violence will go away because it serves no one any good to have it, right? The violence is the last step in adjudicating matters that can't be adjudicated legitimately. So when we look at government action, what do we see inevitably? We see that the bigger the government footprint, the more unintended consequences we find. And if there was ever an advertisement to keep government limited, here it is, right? Because you don't want government exceeding the scope of its own competence. And yet that's what we do time after time after time. And I would contend that it yields in the end a disrespect of government that makes government even less useful. So there's really nothing good that comes when you push the scope of government too far. That's not to say that we don't need it. We very clearly do. From Aristotle to Jefferson, you get largely the same answer on that point, with a few anarchist cranks mixed in for spice and what have you. But for the vast majority of rational people, we understand that, yes, some level of government is absolutely required. But the legitimate question to ask is how much and by what standard? And if you're seeing a raft of unintended consequences, you've gone too far, because people will react to the force of government in ways that no government can ever predict.
And again, this is not a story of government being bad. It's a story of the inappropriate use of government being bad. So going back to the example of the drugs, on the one hand, with this case, we have too much government. On the other hand, we actually have too little. The too much government part is us saying we're going to legislate what drugs peaceful people may and may not consume when they're not harming anybody else. The too little government is on removing protections of the police, of the judicial system, from market participants. So when person A is buying drugs from person B and there's some disagreement here, neither one can go to the courts, can go to the police and say, can you rectify this? There's actually too little government in that instance.
All right, I think that's about all the time we've got to leave some time for questions if anybody's got any. So hopefully somebody, there he is.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah, you guys are great together. I can tell you've been working very closely together for a while now.
The trick is not listening to James. These earphones are great.
Antony's been my work wife for about 10 years now.
Great. Well, first question comes from Robert Evans, and he asks, is a goatee required to be successful in the field of economics?
It's not required, Robert, but it doesn't hurt. It doesn't hurt.
All right. Next, well, I guess, I'll say this. I'll usurp a little bit as, moderator's privilege and just say for those of us that have been here the whole time, we've done a whole conference on the administrative state. And some of our speakers, like, for example, Dr. Brad Watson, pointed out we're leaving the Constitution behind. So I think a lot of the things you've been talking about are well and good, and capitalist within the framework of our Constitution seems like it would work well. Are we in danger? Are you worried about some form of crony capitalism coming if we veer too far from the Constitution by building out the administrative state? And
no, absolutely. And I think if the thing that we say over and over again when we write, especially things that we think politicians may read, is we recommend that they return to Article 1, Section 8 to get a good understanding of what's even allowed to the legislative branch to consider. And ultimately, I think this is a failure on the part of the people, right? We decided, for whatever our reasons over the years, not to hold government's feet to the fire. And after we lapsed on our part, well, you see all kinds of terrible things happening in all three branches, frankly, where politicians just keep going and going and going, and they're going to keep going until somebody lets them hear an emphatic no. And the only way to let them hear an emphatic no is to look at Article 1, Section 8, understand the appropriate realm of Congress to legislate, and demand that they never go beyond those listed items. I understand that the necessary and proper clause follows. Even so, we've gone so far afield here. We're at the point where almost anything is just off the cuff considered interstate commerce. Therefore, the federal government can do whatever it wants. Well, that's our fault. We allowed that to happen. I can cut a pass to people in the first couple of years, but look, it's been a trend since the 30s and 40s. It's on us at this point to take control of this Leviathan and beat it back to its proper sphere. Until we do that.
Notice that this is much more a problem with the federal government than it is the state governments, because people have the ability to move. If I don't like what my state is doing, I can go to Ohio, I can go to Maryland, something else. And that ability to move forces states in a real sense to compete in the same way businesses compete for market share. States have got to compete for businesses and for taxpayers.
Yeah.
And of course, there's some friction there, so they're not going to compete as hard as businesses do, but they will compete. And that's something that the federal government does not have to do because there's nowhere to go. Well, I guess you can go to some other country, but generally speaking, the problems would be about the same, if not worse. But more than that, to leave the United States requires the permission of the United States government and the government that whose country you're going to go to. Oh, and now the United States is starting to tax people who move abroad and take their assets with them. So there's a real cost to this at a federal level that doesn't exist at a state level. So to the extent that we can go back to the way the founders intended, govern more at a state and local level, less at a federal level, you bring to bear the same market forces of competition in the political sphere that we enjoy in the economic sphere.
Right. And if you think about this, a lot of people aren't going to be able to say something like, okay, I'm living here in Connecticut. It's gotten out of hand. I really need to move out of state. There are a number of people who just don't have the means to do that. Okay, set that aside for a second as a realization. When you take a look at what's actually happening with outflows from certain states, even given that impediment, you see very pronounced outflows from certain places. And Connecticut is one of them, my home state. There is no force on earth strong enough to drag me back there. And I know any number of people who are leaving. And you start to see the decline. And it's not just Connecticut, it's all the New England states. And New York and New Jersey. You've got a big chunk of the northeastern United States that's really having some trouble. Head out west, and you see the same exact phenomenon in California. Then there are states that are net receivers, right? So Arizona, my new home state, lots of people are moving here. Why? Well, it's a friendlier tax environment, right? If you've got a choice and you can call where you're going to live, you might pick here. Other places that are picking up a lot of the slack, Tennessee, Kentucky, Florida, Georgia, right? Places like this. So even given that a large number of people can't move, we see evidence of large numbers of people moving.
And notice as well, there will always be some people who can't afford to move, but this phenomenon benefits them also. Everybody doesn't have to leave the state, only enough for politicians to start taking notice and to start changing whatever's wrong in state A to match what's good in state B.
Yeah, I think Frankie here in the comments hits it just right, though. There is a problem when you start to think about this, right? There's going to be a tremendous lag time between when something occurs and when politicians start to react to it. Mm-hmm. So in California, we see functionally one-party rule. And when you see one-party rule, all kinds of ill effects follow. Right, there is no opposition party that's in danger of taking control of anything there. And what do you see? You see declining standards all across the state. It's getting to be a real problem. And their answer to this point seems to be, let's do more of what got us here in the first place. So deeply problematic here. And notice at the end of whatever story we're addressing, Antony, there's no perfect answer. There are better answers and worse answers, but you're not going to find perfection in the realm of politics or in the realm of economics. You'll do better, you'll do worse. We're always advocating for that which is better. So we're not in search of some pie in the sky utopia. We're looking for how is it that we can make everybody's lives a little better right now? And a succession of questions and answers on that line yields very good outcomes over time.
Right. Okay, great. So I figured out that I can knock out a lot of people's questions all at once. Tons of people are asking you about emergencies. Victor asks about it very broadly. Charlie Duman mentions price gouging in response to, for example, toilet paper shelves being empty today. Bobby mentions the Great Depression and, the sort of policies that were minimum wage was put into place as a response to that. So, Ryan also talks about COVID-19. So what's your take? So what changes in an emergency?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. it depends on the type of emergency, right? And just because it's an emergency doesn't mean that the government is more capable than anybody else to solve the problem. And that's one of the interesting things that I've been noticing with our current situation, which is the federal government is kind of held back. And consequently, the states and even local governments have taken the lead in, some of them imposing price restrictions, some of them imposing quarantines or limited business hours or whatever it is. And what you get here is a whole bunch of different governmental organizations trying a whole bunch of different things. Some of them are stupid. Some of them actually are efficacious. But the good thing here is that we can observe and see which ones are working well, which ones are working poorly, and the ones that have made poor choices can mimic what the other ones have done, which is a lot different than the solution you get when the federal government imposes a coast-to-coast solution. If it happens to impose a good coast-to-coast solution, fine, things get better. If it happens to impose a bad one, you kind of have nothing to compare it to because there's no experimentation. And furthermore, the likelihood is much higher that the solution it's going to impose is going to be bad because we've got 350 million people with very different needs. James has a distinct need for water where he lives. I have a problem with water too. There's too much of it, right? And so because of all of these differences, any single coast-to-coast solution is necessarily going to be bad for a bunch of people.
Right. And Ant and I have written a number of times on price controls, most recently a week ago. And, generally speaking, we're full square opposed, right? Price controls yield all kinds of mischief in a market. Now, there's an interesting thing that's been happening lately that I'm very much in favor of, right? Price gouging is always the concern. The concern is that you'll get to the store and toilet paper will cost $1,738. Okay, store owners realize that they have to keep good relations with the customers they've got. That's the impediment that works best against out of control pricing. There is going to be a sweet spot. The sweet spot is inevitably higher than it is during regular peaceful times. You will have to pay more for all kinds of things during emergencies, but how much more is always the question. Governments come in, state governments, and they typically say no more than 20% over the non-emergency price. And that may well not be the correct answer. And I went to 6 or 8 stores in Tucson, Arizona yesterday, and the empty shelves were testament to that, right? We didn't raise the prices high enough. How do I know the shelves are all empty? But there is a level to which a storekeeper can raise a price and harm his business, because he's got to keep in mind that next month, when everything goes back to normal, I'm going to want all these people to come back. And that's, I think, a much more realistic control on prices than any government edict. But somewhere in there, what you end up finding is that there is a natural rate that people find in a cooperative market, right? Nothing's ever worth more than one person is willing to pay. And that's where you really start with these things. Where it all shakes out, is there a perfect answer? I doubt it. But is there a better answer than we've got? Yeah, probably quite a number of them.
Right. Charlie has pointed out to me that I've known him for 3 years and should know how to pronounce his last name. French, I would say maybe Dumont or something. Who knows? You can tell me next time you see me. The next question comes from Nico Silva again, and he asks, how do we square low profit margins of most corporations with high CEO salaries?
Yeah,
actually a good question.
It is a good question. And again, we come back to this problem of people misperceiving things. And let's use Amazon as an example. And Jeff Bezos has whatever, I forget what his salary is. We looked up his salary and benefits several months ago. We were writing an article on this.
He's doing okay.
Yeah, he's doing fine. Because somebody had said, well, he should just take less of a salary and pay his workers more, living wage. Yeah, except I understand he's earning this tremendous amount of money, but there's also a tremendous number of workers. And if you do the math, if you took his entire salary and compensation, all of it, 100%, and divided amongst all the workers, each worker would get like a penny an hour more. And so I was having this conversation with somebody, and I pointed this out. And I said, look, if you really want to help Amazon's workers, the way to do it is not to zero out Jeff Bezos' salary. That's not going to do anything. The way to do it is to put a $2 surcharge on every Amazon purchase.
Well, zero out the free shipping.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A $2 surcharge on every Amazon purchase would generate enough revenue to raise everybody at Amazon to $15 an hour overnight. And interestingly, the person came back to me and said, no, I don't want to do that. I'm happy with Amazon's prices.
Yeah.
Well, look at what's happening here. The person is perfectly willing to take somebody else's salary to give it to these people who the person says needs it, but the person's not willing to shell out a couple bucks, him or herself, to do the same thing.
But Ant, there's more to the story. There's a part you've skipped. Excuse me. And that's that when we look at CEO salaries, we're seeing the absolute top of the heap. It's kind of like asking what baseball players make and using Mookie Betts as your answer. All right, that's true. Mookie's making a lot of money. The average baseball player, the average professional baseball player is, I believe, in the United States making way under $30,000 because it includes all those guys in the minor leagues. Okay, what's the average CEO wage? That's really the question to ask. And if you look at CEO wages across the country, top to bottom, the average CEO, I believe, is making under $200,000 a year.
Yeah, that's correct.
I think it's just a hair under 200,000. But when you look at Bezos or any of these superstar CEOs, you get a distorted view of the market and what it will bear.
You do, and politicians will make use of this. You'll hear politicians saying things like, well, the top 400 CEOs earn an average of, I don't know what the number is, multi-tens of millions of dollars, and that's 300 times what the average worker earns. Well, hang on here. You just compared the top 1% of 1% of CEOs to everybody. Let's be more honest here. Let's compare the average of all CEOs to the average of all workers. And when you do that, you find the ratio is about 4 to 1. The average CEO makes about 4 times what the average worker does. Now, if you want to talk about the top 400, let's talk about them. But compare them not to all workers, but to the top non-CEO executives. And again, you find the ratio is about 4 to 1. So if you make the right apples comparison, it's about 4 to 1, CEO to non-CEO.
It gets really interesting. And at the end of the day, you have to realize that CEO labor is a market like literally everything else. And a CEO is worth exactly what someone else will pay him. And then you're subject to boards of directors and things like this. And if you're not delivering on the promises you make, you get shown the door pretty quickly. And actually, I believe we did a little more digging on this once upon a time and found that those big income years for CEOs are actually compressed into the end of a work life. So you're typically looking at guys north of 60, south of 70, who are in that sweet spot where they got a lot of experience and they've got a lot of juice, and that's when they make their big money.
But like the NFL players, they're at that high level for a short number of years.
Yeah, and it always, upon further reflection, it's always different than it first appeared to be.
And this is another thing. People seem not to get bent out of shape when a Hollywood star earns multi-tens of millions or a sports star earns multi-tens of millions, but they do get bent out of shape when a CEO does. I submit that one possible explanation is that we understand what the Hollywood star does. We understand what the NFL star does. We can see them doing it. We don't understand what CEOs do. And so we just assume that if they're earning tens of millions of dollars, they must not be worth it. I mean, how hard can that job be anyway?
Well, I think it's a step further than that. Not only do people understand what star athletes and actors do, they know they can't do it. Right? Everybody knows.
Right.
Everybody knows if they have the talent to play in the major leagues. And the answer is almost always no for almost always everyone. CEOs, on the other hand, people think they can do it, largely because it's behind a veil of a sort. They don't know the day-to-day on the job. If they knew the day-to-day on the job, most people would know they couldn't do it too.
But people would say, though, that the CEOs, the main forces, market forces acting the CEO, is they want to raise their own salary and they want to show investors high profit margins, and maybe that's not the best system for the workers because the workers don't enter that equation as much.
There's a seedy underbelly to it too that your question alludes to, right? What do CEOs want to do? They want to show the most profitability right now. So often what you get is these particular forces coming together in such a way that they sell out a long-term vision for a lot of short-term gain, and that's a real problem. And notice here, Ant and I will explain this. We'll say this is better, this is worse. We'll never say this is perfect. Is it the case that workers are often valued less than they would be under other circumstances? Yeah, I think so. Is it often the case that CEOs are overvalued? Well, I think that's true too. But by and large, I think we do a relatively good job. And these are the sorts of qualifiers that we always throw onto these sorts of considerations.
Yeah, or to say it another way, I cannot conceive of any system that would achieve a better outcome. There may be one, but I can't conceive of a system that would achieve a better outcome than this imperfect outcome that we currently have.
Right. And if you think about CEOs, right, you're left with the outliers like Chainsaw Al Dunlop, whose stock in trade was walking into a company, carving it up to bits. I mean, his name, Chainsaw Al, comes from this behavior. And clearly, if you've got a long-term time horizon, this is destructive behavior. And there are quite a number of people who lose their livelihoods in the near term because Al took a decidedly short-term point of view. Right. But he was enabled by stockholders who also took a decidedly short-term point of view. And it's never just one person to blame for this sort of thing.
Right. Yeah, I think it's important. That's important to say that, there's no perfect system. We just have the best system. And there's trade-offs if choosing another system. I guess this will probably have to be the last question from Harry, which is he's interested in policy alternatives aimed at helping those making minimum wage, meaning that would not carry the downsides of raising minimum wage. Or is it just something the government should leave as is? Meaning, I think he likes your ideas of getting rid of minimum wage, but should we do something to help these people that are now going to have lower wages?
Well, given the numbers that we're looking at here, we are really looking at about 1.5% of the American workforce. And the thing that you have to remember before you start with policy aimed at making their lives better is that the minimum wage is literally zero, right? Something that you do today will yield unemployment for somebody tomorrow, and his wage will be zero. So you have to start with that. And you used the word just a second ago, trade-offs, something that we probably haven't said enough today. Every single policy is an exercise in balancing trade-offs. So you have to ask some very difficult questions. I don't know if the correct answer is not having anything at all buttressing the wage rate, although I'm inclined to think it probably is. But notice I'm not willing to jump off that cliff. I think we'd have a lot of very difficult considerations to make. But when I look at the minimum wage in some states right now, about $7.50 an hour, balanced against what we have here in Arizona, about 12, to other places that are 15, what do you notice given the delta? You notice that people who really need to have a job, either to get some money fast or to gain the experience they need to do well in the marketplace, they can't get these entry-level jobs. Why not? Because if a job is paying $15 an hour, there's all kinds of people who will drop whatever they're doing at home to go take those jobs. And it has the net effect of forcing a certain group of people out of the workforce who now can literally not get the necessary work experience to break out of minimum wage in the first place. And I don't know how you start to square that without doing harm to someone.
Yeah, I agree with everything James said. I'll just point out that I think while I don't know what the right answer is, I know the path to a better answer. And that's to do what we've currently been doing, which is leave the federal government out of it. Let the states experiment, let the cities experiment. Seattle, there's a big to-do when Seattle raised its minimum wage to $15 an hour. And people said to me, well, what do you think about that as an economist? I said, I think it's an excellent idea. I think it's a horrible thing, right? I think it'll be bad for the people of Seattle, but it's excellent in that this is an experiment. If I'm wrong, if it does work out, we'll all see that and we'll realize, okay, this is something we should do. If it turns out the way I predict it's going to turn out, we'll all see that and say, wait a minute, this was a bad idea. We got to try something else. We can experiment like that so long as the federal government keeps its nose out of it.
Yeah, and notice what Ant just said there. If he's wrong, he'll change his mind. And I think that's the necessary precondition. That's the thing that most ideologues miss, right? They're going to be right no matter what evidence comes to counter them. But I'm happy to be wrong, especially if by changing my mind, people have a better life. And that's, I think, where good people of goodwill have to meet, right? So does the $15 an hour wage work? I don't know, but we're going to have some interesting data coming in from Seattle. Does a $12 wage work? Well, let's check out what happens here in the desert. We'll get back to you. It's going to take a couple of years to figure it out, and we're going to argue about it along the way, but we will have a lot more to understand than we now do. So, 1,000 different approaches yields 1,000 different answers, and then we can compare cases.
Mm-hmm. Right. Great. Well, a lot of humility in that final answer, which I think is a great note to end on for you guys.
I would remind your listeners, we have our book, Cooperation and Coercion, which you can find right there, James.
Find it right here.
And as long as we're plugging things, check out our podcast, Words and Numbers, which you can find on all the major podcast players.
Yeah, and if you're in the webinar, you can see the pinned to the top of the chat is a link to where you can buy Cooperation and Coercion, which is on isibooks.org.
And we've all got plenty of time right now, so go do it.
That's right.
Now's the time to get your reading in, and I'm sure many of you will want to after this talk.
Hope we see all of you down the road somewhere. Thanks for sitting in with us on this very, very strange presentation.
James,
right.
What?
Right. Thanks for coming on, guys.
Thank you.
All right. I'll just wrap up quickly for those of you that have been on with me for this whole time. I had a blast. I really thought that this was a very fun way to spend a day. I thought it was a great replacement for it was a great lineup for the Pittsburgh conference. Shoot us some messages on social media. Let us know what worked and what didn't work. We have a lot of other things coming up on the pipeline for you guys. The Indianapolis conference, something similar is going to happen. So stay tuned. That's going to be a conference in April on just war and national security. So we'll have kind of someone with a more hawkish perspective from the Foundation of Defensive Democracies and someone with more dove perspective from the from Cato Institute, for lack of a better terms. We'll also have a philosopher talking about just war. We'll have Thomas Pickering, who's the former Deputy Secretary of State, former ambassador to the UN, talking about national security from an inside perspective. So that conference coming up. We have other things. If you're a society leader, there will be more resources directed directly at you coming down the pipeline, and society members as well. There's plenty that we're going to be doing in the online space coming up. Not to mention beyond conferences, we'll have some lectures that we're streaming on here in Big Marker and on our Facebook page. So don't be worried that ISI is leaving you just because you can't go to school right now. In fact, you have tons more opportunities to reach even more students. Thank you all for coming. I think that I learned, I hope you learned as much as I did about the administrative state. It really sort of, stirs my heart in terms of not just that a very unjust thing is happening, that people that aren't elected in office are doing what people that are elected should be doing, but also it's not working and there are solutions. We kind of learned what those were today. I hope you guys keep coming to more of these. This has been really fun, and as far as I can tell, it's been a success. So I'm going to keep plugging ahead with them. So thank you all, and goodbye.